In the pre-dawn hours of January 3rd, 1868, a group of young samurai from the Satsuma and Choshu domains stormed the imperial palace in Kyoto. Their mission was not to overthrow the emperor, but to restore him. What followed in the coming decades would transform Japan from an isolated feudal archipelago into a modern industrial power capable of challenging the greatest empires on Earth. This transformation, known as the Meiji Restoration, would set Japan on a path toward empire that would reshape the destiny of Asia and the Pacific. For over 250 years, Japan had been ruled not by its emperors, but by military dictators called shoguns. The Tokugawa shogunate, which came to power in 1603, had kept Japan largely isolated from the outside world through a policy known as sakoku, or closed country. Foreign trade was restricted to a single Dutch trading post on an artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor, and Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving the country on pain of death. The emperor resided in Kyoto as a ceremonial figurehead, revered but powerless, while the shogun governed from Edo, the city that would later become Tokyo. This carefully maintained isolation began to crumble in the middle of the 19th century. In July 1853, 4 black-holed American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay, their steam engines and modern cannons representing everything Japan's medieval military forces could not match. Perry carried a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding that Japan open its ports to American trade. The shogunate, recognizing its military weakness, had little choice but to comply. In March 1854, Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, the first of what would become known as the Unequal Treaties. These treaties were devastating to Japanese sovereignty. They forced Japan to open specific ports to foreign trade, imposed low fixed tariffs that Japan could not change, and most humiliating of all, granted extraterritoriality to foreigners, meaning that Western citizens accused of crimes in Japan would be tried in their own consular courts rather than Japanese ones. Similar treaties followed with Britain, Russia, and other Western powers. Japan found itself in the same position as China, carved up by foreign powers and unable to control its own affairs. The shogunate's inability to resist Western pressure sparked a crisis that would ultimately destroy it. Two competing slogans emerged among the samurai class. Some called for Sono Joy, revere the emperor and expel the barbarians. Others advocated Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country and strengthen the army. What united both camps was a recognition that Japan's feudal system had failed. The country was militarily weak, technologically backward, and politically fragmented into hundreds of semi-independent domains controlled by feudal lords called daimyo. The decisive moment came in late 1867. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the 15th and final shogun, recognized that his position had become untenable. On November 9th, he formally resigned and offered to return governing power to Emperor Komei. But Komei died suddenly just weeks later, and his 15-year-old son ascended the throne, taking the name Mutsuhito and choosing Wamdestai quote das Deisoslistais as his reign name, meaning enlightened rule. The young emperor would reign for the next 44 years, presiding over Japan's transformation from feudal state to modern empire. The samurai coalition that had engineered the restoration moved quickly to consolidate power. They came primarily from the southwestern domains of Satsuma and Choshu, regions that had historically opposed the Tokugawa and now saw their chance to reshape Japan entirely. These were young men, mostly in their 20s and 30s, drawn from the lower ranks of the samurai class. They had studied Western military science, witnessed firsthand the humiliations inflicted by foreign powers, and were determined that Japan would never again be so vulnerable. In April 1868, Emperor Meiji issued the Charter Oath, a document that laid out the broad principles that would guide the new government. It promised to seek knowledge throughout the world, to establish deliberative assemblies, to allow all classes to pursue their aspirations, to abandon evil customs of the past, and to base all actions on the just laws of nature. These were revolutionary statements in a society that had been rigidly hierarchical for centuries, where one's birth determined one's entire life path, and where questioning tradition could mean death. The new government faced immediate challenges. The imperial capital had been in Kyoto for over 1,000 years, but the Meiji leaders understood that to truly break with the past, they needed a fresh start. In 1868, they relocated the capital to Edo, renaming it Tokyo, meaning Eastern Capital. The young emperor moved into the former shogun's castle, a powerful symbol of the new order. But controlling Tokyo was not the same as controlling Japan. The country remained divided into hundreds of domains, each with its own army, its own tax system, and its own semi-independent daimyo. The solution came in 1871 with the abolition of the Han system. The domains were dissolved and replaced with prefectures governed by officials appointed by the central government. The daimyo, in exchange for giving up their lands and their armies, received government pensions and noble titles. It was a bloodless revolution in governance, centralizing power in Tokyo in a way that would have seemed impossible just years before. Some historians compare it to what would happen if the United States were to abolish its state governments overnight and replace them with federal districts. The speed and thoroughness of this transformation was without parallel in world history. With centralization came the need to dismantle the old feudal order entirely. The samurai class, which had been the warrior elite of Japanese society for centuries, suddenly found itself obsolete. In 1876, the government stripped samurai of their exclusive right to bear swords and abolished the stipends they had received for generations. Overnight, hundreds of thousands of samurai were rendered unemployed, their social status eliminated, their traditional way of life destroyed. Many struggled to adapt. Some became farmers or merchants, occupations they had once looked down upon. Others seethed with resentment. The most dramatic challenge came in 1877, when Saigo Takamori, one of the heroes of the Restoration itself, led a rebellion of disgruntled samurai in Satsuma. Saigo had been one of the three heroes of the Meiji Restoration, but he had become disillusioned with the rapid westernization and the destruction of samurai culture. His rebellion drew thousands of followers, men who preferred to die fighting than to accept the new order. The government crushed the rebellion decisively, using its newly created conscript army. The message was clear: the age of the samurai was over. Saigo himself died in the fighting, committing seppuku rather than face capture. His last stand became legendary, immortalized in Japanese culture as the final flowering of the samurai spirit, even as that very spirit was being systematically eradicated. The conscript army that defeated Saigo was itself a revolution. In 1873, the government had enacted the conscription law, requiring 3 years of military service from all able-bodied men, regardless of class. This was a radical departure from centuries of tradition. For the first time in Japanese history, commoners, farmers, and merchants would serve as soldiers. Initially, there was significant resistance. Many farmers resented losing their sons to military service. Some committed self-mutilation to avoid the draft. But the government was determined to create a modern, European-style military force. The architect of this new military was Omura Masujiro, who established Japan's first military academy in Kyoto in 1868. Omura envisioned an army based on merit rather than birth, trained in Western tactics, and equipped with modern weapons. His ideas were so radical that conservative samurai assassinated him in 1869, but his vision survived him. The government brought in French military advisors to train the new imperial army along European lines. They established arsenals in Tokyo and Osaka to manufacture modern weapons and ammunition. By the late 1870s, Japan had a standing army of over 100,000 men, organized into divisions with modern artillery and rifles. The Navy underwent an even more dramatic transformation. In the 1850s, Japan's Navy had consisted of coastal defense vessels and a handful of wooden warships. By the 1880s, it was purchasing ironclad battleships and cruisers from Britain and building its own modern warships in Japanese dockyards. The government initially adopted French naval doctrine, which emphasized smaller, faster vessels using torpedo attacks against larger ships. This seemed practical for a nation with limited resources. But as Japan's industrial capacity grew, its naval ambitions grew with it. Japanese officers studied at British naval academies, learning the tactics and technologies that had made Britain the world's dominant sea power. Military modernization required industrial modernization, and here the Meiji government pursued an aggressive strategy of state-led development. They understood that a modern military required modern industry, and modern industry required infrastructure, education, and capital that private enterprise alone could not provide quickly enough. The government built railways, telegraph lines, and modern ports. They established model factories for textiles, weapons, and shipbuilding. They brought in over 3,000 foreign experts, called Oyatoe Gaikokujin, or hired foreigners, to teach Japanese workers everything from mining techniques to banking practices. These foreign experts came from across the industrialized world. French engineers built railways, British naval architects designed warships, German doctors staffed hospitals, American agricultural scientists improved farming techniques. The government paid them handsomely, sometimes more than Japanese ministers earned, but considered it money well spent. The goal was not to remain dependent on foreign expertise, but to learn from it and then surpass it. Young Japanese studied everything these experts had to teach, took detailed notes, asked endless questions, and then began to modify and improve upon Western methods. At the same time, the government sent thousands of Japanese students abroad. The most famous was the Iwakura mission of 1871 to 1873, which took nearly half the Meiji government's top officials on an extended study tour of the United States and Europe. They visited factories, attended parliamentary sessions, toured military bases, and met with political leaders. They returned convinced that Western power rested on three foundations: constitutional government, industrial development, and modern military force. Japan, they concluded, would need all three. Education became a national priority. In 1872, the government established a national school system based on Western models. Elementary education became compulsory for both boys and girls, a radical step in a country where literacy had previously been limited largely to the samurai class and wealthy merchants. By the end of the Meiji period, nearly all Japanese children attended school for at least 6 years. The curriculum emphasized not just reading and writing, but also loyalty to the emperor and service to the nation. Schools became instruments of nation building, creating a unified Japanese identity where, before, there had been only local and regional loyalties. The government also reformed the economy fundamentally. In 1873, they enacted the land tax reform, which for the first time in Japanese history recognized private ownership of land. Previously, all land had theoretically belonged to the emperor or the feudal lords. Now, farmers could own their land, but they also had to pay taxes on it in cash rather than in rice. This forced peasants into the money economy and provided the government with a stable source of revenue to fund its modernization programs. Many farmers struggled under the new system, and rural poverty remained widespread. But the reform created the fiscal foundation for Japan's industrial expansion. The government initially tried to build key industries directly, establishing state-owned factories for textiles, cement, glass, and other products. But running these enterprises proved expensive and often inefficient. In 1880, the government began selling most of these state industries to private investors, though usually at prices well below their actual value. The buyers were often former samurai and wealthy merchants who had the capital and connections to make these enterprises succeed. Some built massive industrial conglomerates called zaibatsu, family-controlled business empires that would dominate Japanese industry for decades. The four largest were Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Yasuda. These zaibatsu worked hand in hand with the government, building the railways, ships, and factories that would make Japan an industrial power. Yet even as Japan raced to modernize, the Meiji leaders remained acutely aware of their vulnerability. The unequal treaties remained in force. Foreign warships patrolled Japanese waters. Western diplomats lived in special settlements where Japanese law did not apply. Every reminder of these humiliations strengthened the determination to build Japan into a power that could stand equal with the West. The slogan, Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country and strengthen the army, became the guiding principle of the era. Economic development and military power were understood as inseparable. Japan would need both to revise the treaties and to defend itself in what the Meiji leaders saw as a ruthlessly competitive world, where only the strong survived. The political system remained authoritarian despite talk of deliberative assemblies. Real power rested with a small group of former samurai from Satsuma and Choshu, men who controlled the government from behind the scenes, even as they officially served as advisors to the emperor. The emperor himself wielded no direct political power, but served as the sacred center of the new national ideology. The government promoted state Shinto, transforming what had been a diverse collection of local religious practices into a unified national cult centered on emperor worship. Shinto, Japan's indigenous religion, taught that the emperor was descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu and was therefore semi-divine. This ideology served to legitimate the government's authority and to create a sense of national unity and purpose. By the late 1880s, pressure was growing for a more representative government. The freedom and people's rights movement, led by former samurai and wealthy commoners, demanded a constitution and an elected parliament. The Meiji leaders resisted at first, fearing that democracy would weaken national unity and slow modernization. But they also recognized that Western nations would not take Japan seriously as a civilized power unless it had constitutional government. Moreover, they believed a carefully designed constitution could actually strengthen rather than weaken their control. The task of drafting a constitution fell to Ito Hirobumi, one of the most capable of the Meiji leaders. Ito traveled to Europe to study constitutional systems, spending the most time in Germany, where he found a model that appealed to him. The German Empire under Bismarck had a constitution and a parliament, but real power remained with the Kaiser and his ministers. This seemed perfect for Japan's needs. In 1889, on February 11th, the anniversary of the legendary founding of Japan, Emperor Meiji promulgated the Constitution of the Empire of Japan. The Meiji Constitution was a masterpiece of controlled reform. It established a bicameral parliament called the Diet, with a House of Representatives elected by male taxpayers and a House of Peers composed of nobles and imperial appointees. The Diet could pass laws and had to approve the budget, giving it real if limited power. The Constitution also guaranteed certain rights, freedom of religion, speech, and assembly, though all of these could be restricted by law. Trials would be public and judges would be independent. But sovereignty remained entirely with the emperor, not the people. The emperor appointed the prime minister and could dissolve the Diet. Most importantly, the military was not subject to civilian control. The army and navy ministers reported directly to the emperor, not to the cabinet or parliament. This would have profound consequences in the coming decades, allowing the military to operate increasingly independently of civilian government. But in 1889, these implications were not yet apparent. What mattered was that Japan had joined the ranks of constitutional nations. Newspapers from London to Shanghai celebrated Japan's achievement. Fireworks lit up Japanese cities. The nation felt it had taken a decisive step toward equality with the Western powers. The Meiji Constitution and the rapid modernization of the 1870s and 1880s laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Japan had transformed itself from a feudal society on the brink of colonization into a unified nation-state with a modern military, a growing industrial base, and constitutional government. The unequal treaties had not yet been revised, but Japan was building the strength to demand revision from a position of power rather than weakness. More fundamentally, the Meiji Restoration had created a new kind of nationalism. The Japanese people, who had previously identified primarily with their local domains and classes, were being taught to see themselves as Japanese first and foremost, subjects of a divine emperor leading a unique nation with a special destiny. This nationalism was forward-looking, embracing Western technology and institutions, but it also drew on older traditions of loyalty, sacrifice, and martial valor. The samurai spirit, officially abolished, was being universalized and militarized, extended to all Japanese through schools and military service. By 1890, Japan stood at a threshold. It had built the foundations of empire, a modern military, industrial capacity, national unity, and burning ambition. The 20 years since the Restoration had been years of internal transformation, of learning from the West and creating the structures that would allow Japan to compete with Western powers. The next phase would test whether that transformation had been sufficient. Japan would turn its attention outward, toward Korea, toward China, toward the struggle for power and resources in East Asia. The lessons of the Meiji Restoration, The determination to never again be weak, the conviction that only through strength could Japan be secure, would drive Japanese policy for the next half-century. The empire was not yet born, but its birth was now inevitable. The decade of the 1890s found Japan at a crossroads. The country had modernized its institutions, built a constitutional government, and created a formidable military machine. But one fundamental humiliation remained: the unequal treaties. Japanese diplomats still watched helplessly as Western nations imposed low tariffs on Japanese goods and granted their citizens extraterritorial rights on Japanese soil. The Meiji leaders understood that true equality with the Western powers would require not just modern institutions, but demonstrations of strength. Japan needed to prove itself on the battlefield, to show that it could defeat another Asian power decisively and claim its place among the world's empires. The opportunity came in Korea, and with it, the Japanese Empire was born in blood and iron. Korea had been a Chinese tributary state for centuries, sending annual tribute to Beijing and acknowledging Chinese suzerainty over its foreign affairs. But Korea also sat like a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan, separated from the Japanese islands by less than 100 miles of water at the closest point. Japanese strategists called Korea, quote, "Three," and insisted that if a hostile power controlled the peninsula, Japan itself would be vulnerable to invasion. More importantly, Korea represented Japan's first step onto the Asian mainland, a gateway to the resources and markets of China and Manchuria. The Meiji leaders had decided that Japan's security and prosperity required Korean submission. Japan had already made inroads into Korea. In 1876, using gunboat diplomacy similar to what Commodore Perry had employed against Japan 2 decades earlier, Japanese warships had forced Korea to sign the Treaty of Ganghwa, opening Korean ports to Japanese trade and declaring Korea independent from China. This last clause was particularly significant, as it challenged Chinese claims of suzerainty. Korean politics became a battleground between pro-Chinese conservatives and pro-Japanese reformers. In 1884, a group of Japanese-supported reformers attempted a coup. Chinese troops intervened, rescued the Korean king, and massacred several Japanese legation guards. The coup failed, but the incident demonstrated that any Japanese attempt to control Korea would inevitably bring conflict with China. For the next decade, an uneasy equilibrium prevailed. Japan and China signed the Convention of Tientsin in 1885, agreeing that neither would send troops to Korea without notifying the other. Both powers understood this was merely a pause before the inevitable confrontation. Japan spent the time building up its military forces. China, meanwhile, grew complacent. The Qing dynasty had attempted some modernization through the self-strengthening movement, building arsenals and a modern fleet, but these reforms were half-hearted and undermined by corruption. Chinese officials diverted funds meant for the Navy to build a marble boat for the Empress Dowager's garden. The Beiyang Fleet, China's most modern naval force, looked impressive on paper, but suffered from poor training, inadequate maintenance, and incompetent leadership. The crisis came in the spring of 1894. A peasant rebellion called the Donghak Movement erupted in southern Korea, threatening the government in Seoul. The Korean king requested Chinese military assistance, as tributary protocol required. On June 6th, China dispatched 2,800 troops to Korea and notified Japan as the Tientsin Convention required. Japan responded by sending 8,000 troops, far more than necessary to protect Japanese nationals and interests. The Japanese force landed at Incheon on June 9th. Within days, it became clear that Japan had no intention of withdrawing, even after the Korean government suppressed the rebellion with Chinese help. The Japanese government presented a list of reform demands to Korea, insisting that Japan would only withdraw after Korea reformed its government and finances. When the Korean king refused and turned to China for support, Japanese troops stormed the royal palace in Seoul on July 23, 1894, overthrew ministers sympathetic to China, and installed a pro-Japanese government. The new regime immediately requested that Japan expel Chinese forces from Korea. What had begun as a response to a peasant rebellion had become, through careful Japanese planning, a manufactured casus belli for war with China. The first shots came on July 25th before war was formally declared. Japanese warships intercepted the Chinese cruiser Gao Sheng, which was carrying over 1,000 Chinese troops and British crew to Korea. After the British captain surrendered, Japanese ships sank the vessel, drowning hundreds of Chinese soldiers. 2 days later, Japanese forces attacked Chinese troops at Seonghwan, defeating them decisively. On August 1st, both nations formally declared war. Western observers, watching two Asian powers clash using modern weapons for the first time, generally expected China to win. China had 4 times Japan's population, vastly greater resources, and a fleet that on paper matched Japan's. These observers fundamentally misunderstood what Japan had accomplished in the previous 25 years, and how thoroughly China's modernization efforts had failed. The war revealed the gulf between Japanese efficiency and Chinese dysfunction. On September 15, 1894, Japanese forces attacked Chinese positions at Pyongyang, the capital of northern Korea. The Battle of Pyongyang involved 16,000 Japanese troops against 13,000 to 15,000 Chinese defenders in strong fortifications. Japanese forces used coordinated infantry assaults, supported by artillery, to overwhelm Chinese positions. The Chinese suffered over 2,000 killed and 4,000 wounded, while Japanese casualties totaled only about 600. More importantly, the defeat opened all of Korea to Japanese occupation. Chinese forces retreated across the Yalu River into Manchuria, abandoning Korea entirely. 2 days after Pyongyang, the two fleets clashed in the Battle of the Yalu River, fought on September 17th in the Yellow Sea near the mouth of the Yalu. This was the first major naval engagement between modern steel warships, and it demonstrated Japanese superiority at sea as decisively as Pyongyang had shown it on land. The Chinese Beiyang fleet, commanded by Admiral Ding Ruchang, included 2 German-built battleships with heavy armor and large guns, but most of the fleet consisted of older cruisers with mixed armaments. The Japanese fleet under Admiral Ito Sukeyuki had newer, faster cruisers with uniform armament and better-trained crews. The battle lasted about 5 hours. Japanese ships used their superior speed to concentrate fire on individual Chinese vessels, sinking 5 warships, including the cruiser Zhiwan, whose captain deliberately rammed it into a Japanese ship in a final desperate act that failed. The Japanese fleet suffered damage but lost no ships. The Beiyang fleet's surviving vessels retreated to Port Arthur, essentially ceding control of the Yellow Sea to Japan. This naval victory had strategic consequences far beyond the immediate battle. With command of the sea, Japan could transport troops and supplies to Korea and Manchuria at will, while China could not reinforce or supply its armies effectively. Having secured Korea, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria in October 1894. Port Arthur, a fortress city on the tip of the Liaodong Peninsula, had been considered impregnable. Chinese and foreign engineers had spent years building elaborate fortifications, coastal batteries, and defensive works. The Japanese attacked on November 21, 1894, and captured the fortress in a single day of fighting. What happened next shocked the world and revealed the darker face of Japanese military culture. Japanese soldiers, enraged by finding the mutilated bodies of Japanese prisoners, went on a rampage through the city. For several days, they massacred Chinese civilians, killing thousands of men, women, and children. Foreign observers documented what became known as the Port Arthur Massacre, and international newspapers reported it extensively, tarnishing Japan's image as a civilized power. The Japanese government and military initially tried to deny the massacre, then justified it as retaliation for Chinese atrocities, then finally admitted it had occurred, but blamed the brutality of war. The incident revealed a troubling pattern that would recur throughout Japan's imperial expansion. Moments when military discipline broke down and Japanese soldiers committed atrocities against civilian populations. Yet, the international outrage proved temporary. Western powers, while condemning the massacre in their newspapers, continued to treat Japan as a rising power worthy of respect. The strategic implications of Japan's victory mattered more than the moral implications of its conduct. Through the winter of 1894 and into early 1895, Japanese forces continued to advance. They captured Weihaiwei, another major port on the Shandong Peninsula, in February 1895, trapping the remainder of the Beiyang fleet. After a combined land and sea assault, the Chinese commander surrendered both the fortress and the fleet. With the sea lanes secure and Japanese armies threatening Beijing itself, the Qing court sued for peace. The Chinese government sent Li Hongzhang, their most experienced diplomat and the architect of China's failed modernization efforts, to negotiate with the Japanese at Shimonoseki. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed on April 17, 1895, marked the emergence of Japan as an imperial power. The terms were harsh. China recognized Korea's complete independence, effectively ending centuries of Chinese influence over the peninsula. China ceded Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands to Japan outright, giving Japan its first overseas colony. China also ceded the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, giving Japan a foothold in Manchuria. Most significantly, China agreed to pay Japan an indemnity of 200 million silver taels, roughly equivalent to 3 times Japan's annual national budget. China also granted Japan the same treaty port privileges and commercial rights that Western powers had extracted. Japan had joined the club of imperialist powers. The celebration in Japan lasted exactly 6 days. On April 23, 1895, the governments of Russia, Germany, and France jointly presented Japan with what became known as the Triple Intervention. The 3 powers demanded that Japan return the Liaodong Peninsula to China, arguing that Japanese control of the peninsula would threaten Beijing and make Korean independence meaningless. Behind this diplomatic language lay naked power politics. Russia wanted the peninsula and Port Arthur for itself. Germany and France supported Russia to maintain their alliance with the Tsar and to check Japanese power in Asia. Britain, Japan's potential ally, remained neutral. Japan faced an agonizing choice. The military wanted to fight, arguing that Japan had won the peninsula fair and square. But the government recognized reality. Japan had exhausted its resources defeating China. Its finances were strained, its military needed rest and rearmament, and its navy could not possibly fight Russia, France, and Germany simultaneously. On May 5, 1895, Japan agreed to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China in exchange for an additional indemnity of 30 million tolls. The Japanese people were outraged. They had won a great victory only to see the fruits of that victory stolen by European powers through diplomatic pressure. The phrase, "bear the unbearable," became associated with this moment of national humiliation. The humiliation deepened when, just 3 years later, Russia forced China to lease the very same Liaodong Peninsula to Russia for 25 years. Russian engineers began constructing Port Arthur into a major naval base and building railways to connect it to the Trans-Siberian Railway, which Russia was extending across Siberia to the Pacific. The European powers, having stopped Japan from taking the peninsula, were now carving up Chinese territory for themselves. Germany seized Qingdao, Britain expanded its holdings, and France took territories in southern China. The Triple Intervention taught Japanese leaders a bitter lesson. Military victory alone was not enough. Japan needed powerful allies and a stronger military to resist European interference in Asian affairs. Despite the humiliation of the Triple Intervention, Japan had gained enormously from the war. The indemnity payments from China financed a major expansion of the Japanese military. The government used the windfall to build more warships, expand the army, develop heavy industry, and improve infrastructure. Taiwan became Japan's first colony, a testing ground for colonial administration that would inform later policies in Korea and Manchuria. Japanese administrators in Taiwan faced significant local resistance, including guerrilla warfare that took years to suppress. But they established schools, built railways, improved public health, and began extracting resources. Taiwan demonstrated that Japan could not only win wars, but also govern conquered territories. More fundamentally, victory over China transformed Japan's international status. The country that had been forced to sign unequal treaties 40 years earlier had now defeated the largest nation in Asia. Western powers began to take Japan seriously. In 1894, Britain had agreed to revise the unequal Anglo-Japanese Treaty, a process completed in 1899 when British citizens in Japan finally lost their extraterritorial privileges. Other nations followed suit. By 1900, Japan had achieved tariff autonomy and full legal sovereignty. The unequal treaties, the symbol of Japan's subordination to the West, had been abolished through military victory. The victory also unleashed Japanese imperial ambition. Having defeated China, Japanese attention turned to Russia, the greater threat. Russia's expansion across Siberia and into Manchuria threatened Japanese interests in Korea and China. The Trans-Siberian Railway, inching closer to completion, would allow Russia to transport European troops and supplies to the Far East, fundamentally altering the balance of power. Japanese military planners argued that Japan had a limited window of opportunity to act before Russia became too strong. Some argued for accommodation with Russia, proposing to divide Korea at the 39th parallel. Others insisted that Japan must dominate Korea entirely and resist Russian expansion into Manchuria. The debate consumed Japanese politics for the next several years. In 1902, Japan achieved a diplomatic breakthrough that shaped its path to war with Russia. Britain, concerned about Russian expansion and needing an ally in East Asia, signed the Anglo-Japanese alliance. The treaty specified that if either nation went to war with a single enemy, the other would remain neutral. If a third power joined the enemy, the ally was obligated to enter the war. For Britain, this meant Japan would help contain Russia in Asia. For Japan, it meant protection against another triple intervention. If Japan fought Russia alone, Britain would stay neutral. But if France or Germany joined Russia, Britain would enter the war on Japan's side. The alliance gave Japan the security to confront Russia without fear of European intervention. Negotiations between Japan and Russia dragged on through 1903. Japan proposed that Russia recognize Japanese control of Korea in exchange for Japanese recognition of Russian interests in Manchuria. Russia countered with proposals that would have left Korea divided and limited Japanese influence even in southern Korea. The Tsar and his advisors badly underestimated Japan, convinced that a European power could not lose to an Asian nation. They saw no urgency in reaching agreement and believed that time favored Russia. Each month that passed brought the Trans-Siberian Railway closer to completion and strengthened Russian forces in the Far East. By late 1903, Japanese leaders had decided that war was inevitable and preferable to the alternatives. Waiting would only make Russia stronger. A negotiated settlement that left Russia in Manchuria and divided Korea was unacceptable. On February 8, 1904, without a formal declaration of war, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet at anchor in Port Arthur. The attack damaged several Russian warships and gave Japan an immediate tactical advantage. 2 days later, Japan formally declared war. The Russo-Japanese War had begun. The war that followed shocked the world. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power decisively defeated a European great power. The conflict was fought with modern industrial weapons, machine guns and artillery, barbed wire and trenches, presaging the horrors of World War I. Japanese forces laid siege to Port Arthur, an operation that lasted from August 1904 to January 1905 and cost the Japanese army over 57,000. 000 casualties. The fortress finally fell when the Russian commander surrendered, despite having adequate supplies, a decision that enraged his officers and was later investigated as possible treason. The largest land battle of the war came at Mukden in February and March 1905, where over 600,000 men fought in brutal winter conditions. Japanese forces outmaneuvered the larger Russian army, forcing it to retreat. Japanese casualties exceeded 70,000. Russian casualties may have reached 90,000. The battle demonstrated that Japan could defeat Russia on land, but at terrible cost. Both sides were approaching exhaustion. Japan's finances were strained to the breaking point. Russia faced growing domestic unrest that would explode into revolution. Both needed peace. The naval war reached its climax in May 1905 with the Battle of Tsushima, one of the most decisive naval engagements in history. The Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world to relieve Port Arthur, entered the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan. Admiral Togo Haihachiro, commanding the Japanese fleet, executed a near-perfect victory. Using superior speed, better gunnery, and brilliant tactics, the Japanese fleet destroyed or captured almost the entire Russian squadron. Of 38 Russian ships, only 4 small vessels reached Vladivostok. Russia lost 21 warships sunk and 7 captured, along with nearly 5,000 men killed. Japanese losses totaled 3 torpedo boats and 117 men. The Battle of Tsushima established Japanese naval supremacy in East Asian waters and made continued Russian prosecution of the war virtually impossible. Both sides accepted President Theodore Roosevelt's offer to mediate peace negotiations. The talks took place in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, through August and September 1905. Russia, despite its defeats, was not broken. Its vast resources meant it could continue fighting indefinitely if necessary. Japan, despite its victories, faced financial collapse. The peace had to reflect these military realities rather than the lopsided casualty figures. The Treaty of Portsmouth, signed on September 5, 1905, gave Japan much of what it sought. Russia recognized Japanese paramount interest in Korea, effectively giving Japan a free hand on the peninsula. Russia ceded to Japan its lease of the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, the very territories the Triple Intervention had forced Japan to return a decade earlier. Russia also ceded the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Both powers agreed to withdraw from Manchuria, though both understood this pledge was temporary. What the treaty did not include sparked riots in Japan. Russia refused to pay an indemnity. The Japanese public, which had sacrificed enormously and expected another windfall like the one from China, felt cheated. Riots broke out in Tokyo, martial law was declared, and the government that had negotiated the treaty fell. Yet the treaty was a strategic triumph. Japan had defeated Russia, gained control of Korea, and established itself as the dominant power in Northeast Asia. The cost had been staggering, over 80,000 Japanese dead, and perhaps twice that number wounded, but Japan had achieved its objectives. The Russo-Japanese War sent shockwaves around the world. For the first time since the Mongol invasions, an Asian power had defeated a European power in a major war. Nationalist movements across Asia and Africa drew inspiration from Japan's example, seeing proof that Western dominance was not inevitable. W.E.B. Du Bois noted that colored people everywhere celebrated Japan's victory. Sun Yat-sen and other Chinese revolutionaries saw in Japan's success a model for Chinese modernization. Indians, Vietnamese, and Filipinos drew hope from Japan's triumph. Even in the West, the war changed perceptions. Japan could no longer be dismissed as merely an imitator of Western civilization. It had become a genuine great power. In Russia, defeat sparked the Revolution of 1905, forcing Tsar Nicholas II to grant a constitution and create an elected parliament. The Russian military and government, humiliated by their failures, began a program of reform and modernization that would make Russia a more formidable adversary in the future. The war also marked the beginning of the end for the Romanov dynasty. The strains of the war, the incompetence it revealed, and the revolutionary ferment it sparked would culminate 12 years later in the Bolshevik Revolution. For Japan, victory brought the culmination of its territorial ambitions in Korea, with Russian opposition eliminated and Western acquiescence secured through the Portsmouth Treaty and subsequent agreements. Japan moved quickly to convert Korea into a formal colony. In November 1905, just months after the Portsmouth Treaty, Japan forced Korea to sign the Protectorate Treaty, establishing a Japanese resident general with control over Korean foreign affairs. Korea became a Japanese protectorate in all but name. Korean Emperor Gojong resisted, sending secret envoys to international conferences to protest the treaty's invalidity. When Japan learned of these efforts, they forced Gojong to abdicate in favor of his son, Sunjong, in 1907. The pace of Japanese control accelerated. In 1907, another treaty gave Japan control over Korea's internal administration. The Korean army was disbanded, leaving Korea defenseless. Japanese advisors took control of every Korean government ministry. Korean resistance, both peaceful and armed, was brutally suppressed. The Korean independence movement, known as the Righteous Army, conducted guerrilla warfare against Japanese forces, but they stood no chance against the modern Japanese military. Thousands of Korean fighters were killed, and the resistance was crushed. On August 22, 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea through the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty. Korean Prime Minister Yi Wan-yong, widely regarded as a traitor, signed the treaty on behalf of Emperor Sunjong, who did not personally sign. The treaty's first article stated that the Emperor of Korea ceded complete and permanent sovereignty over Korea to the Emperor of Japan. Korea ceased to exist as an independent nation. The peninsula became Chosen, a Japanese colony governed by a Japanese governor-general with nearly absolute power. The annexation sparked outrage among Koreans, but little international protest. The Western powers, busy with their own imperial projects, accepted Japan's conquest of Korea as a fait accompli. Japanese colonial rule in Korea was harsh from the beginning. The government general established military police rule, giving police powers to suppress any resistance. Korean newspapers were shut down, political organizations banned, and any expression of Korean nationalism criminalized. The Japanese began a systematic effort to erase Korean culture and identity. They removed Korean history from school curricula, promoted Japanese language instruction, and discouraged the use of Korean language. They appropriated Korean land, with Japanese ownership of Korean farmland increasing from 8% at annexation to over 50% by the 1930s. Korean farmers became tenants on land they had once owned, forced to pay crushing rents to Japanese landlords. The annexation of Korea marked the completion of the first phase of Japanese imperial expansion. In just 20 years, from 1890 to 1910, Japan had transformed itself from a newly modernized nation to an imperial power with overseas colonies. It had defeated China decisively, fought Russia to a standstill, and absorbed Korea entirely. Taiwan, Korea, and the Liaodong Peninsula, including the great naval base at Port Arthur, were now Japanese territory. The Japanese Empire had been born, forged through victory in 2 wars and the subjugation of Korea. Yet this empire building had come at a cost. The wars had strained Japanese finances severely. The country had borrowed heavily from foreign lenders, particularly British and American banks, to finance its military expansion. Domestic sacrifices had been enormous, with heavy taxation and conscription touching every Japanese family. The war with Russia had come close to breaking Japan economically. The empire had been won, but it would need to be profitable to justify its costs and sustainable. Japan would need to extract resources and wealth from its colonies to fund further expansion and to repay its debts. This economic imperative would drive increasingly exploitative policies in Taiwan and Korea and fuel Japanese ambitions to expand further into China and Manchuria. The empire also rested on military power and the willingness to use violence against any resistance. The Port Arthur massacre during the war with China and the suppression of Korean resistance demonstrated that Japan would not hesitate to employ brutality to maintain control. This reliance on force would only increase as Japanese ambitions grew. The military had become the dominant force in Japanese politics, and military men increasingly shaped imperial policy. The seeds of future conflicts and of the militarism that would eventually consume Japan were planted in these early victories. But in 1910, those consequences lay in the future. For the moment, Japan stood triumphant, a great power among great powers, master of an empire that stretched across Northeast Asia. The period between 1910 and 1930 witnessed Japan's transformation from a regional power to a recognized member of the global elite. These 2 decades brought contradictions that would define Japan's future. International cooperation alongside aggressive expansion, democratic reforms alongside growing militarism, prosperity alongside social unrest. Japan would join the League of Nations while simultaneously violating Chinese sovereignty. It would adopt universal male suffrage while suppressing leftist movements. The country that emerged from this era was more powerful than ever before, yet also more divided and uncertain about its path forward. The seeds of future disaster were planted during these years of seeming triumph. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Japan saw opportunity where others saw catastrophe. The European powers were destroying each other in the trenches of France and Belgium, leaving their Asian colonies vulnerable and their attention focused thousands of miles away. Britain, Japan's ally since 1902, requested Japanese assistance against German holdings in Asia. Japan needed little encouragement. On August 23, 1914, Japan declared war on Germany, not from any genuine concern about European politics, but from calculated self-interest. Germany's leased territory in Shandong province, including the fortress port of Qingdao, represented exactly the kind of foothold on the Chinese mainland that Japan coveted. The siege of Qingdao began in October 1914. Japanese forces, supported by a small British contingent, surrounded the German garrison. The fortress fell on November the 7th after a siege that cost fewer than 800 Japanese casualties. Japan had secured its objective with minimal effort, but Japan's ambitions extended far beyond Qingdao. Japanese forces occupied German possessions throughout the Pacific, the Marshall Islands, the Carolines, the Marianas. These scattered archipelagos would become crucial Japanese bases in future conflicts, but in 1914 they were simply prizes claimed, while Europe was distracted. While Japanese troops campaigned in China and the Pacific, Japanese industry boomed. European nations, desperate for supplies and munitions, placed massive orders with Japanese manufacturers. Japanese shipyards built vessels for Britain and France. Japanese factories produced steel, chemicals, and textiles for Allied consumption. Japanese merchant ships transported goods throughout Asia, while European shipping was diverted to the war effort. The war economy created unprecedented prosperity. Between 1914 and 1918, Japanese industrial production nearly doubled. Exports increased fourfold. Japan, which had been a debtor nation in 1914, became a creditor by 1918, lending money to its European allies. The Zaibatsu conglomerates grew enormously wealthy, expanding into new industries and markets. Yet this prosperity was unevenly distributed. Urban workers faced inflation that outpaced wage increases. Rice prices doubled, then tripled. Rural farmers, who made up the majority of Japan's population, saw little benefit from the industrial boom while struggling to afford basic necessities. The gap between rich and poor, between industrial cities and agricultural villages, widened dramatically. These economic tensions would explode in violence before the decade ended. In early 1915, with European powers preoccupied by the Western Front, Japan moved to consolidate and expand its position in China. On January 18, 1915, Japanese Minister Hioki Eki presented Chinese President Yuan Shikai with a secret document that would become infamous: the 21 Demands. The demands were organized into 5 groups, each more intrusive than the last. The first group required China to recognize Japanese control over former German holdings in Shandong province. The second extended Japanese leases in Manchuria for 99 years and granted Japanese citizens extensive rights to travel, trade, and own property there. The third gave Japan control over major Chinese mining companies. The fourth prohibited China from leasing any coastal territory to foreign powers other than Japan. The fifth group shocked even Japan's allies. It demanded that China accept Japanese advisors in key government ministries, that Chinese police be placed under Japanese supervision, that China purchase most of its weapons from Japan, and that Japan be granted railway concessions throughout central China. If implemented, these demands would have reduced China to a Japanese protectorate, ending Chinese sovereignty in all but name. Yuan Shikai stalled, hoping that international pressure would force Japan to moderate its demands. He leaked the full contents to Western powers, calculating that Britain and the United States would object to Japan's attempt to monopolize China. His calculation proved partially correct. The United States issued a diplomatic note expressing concern about threats to Chinese sovereignty and the open door policy. Britain, despite its alliance with Japan, also expressed disapproval. But with the war consuming all their attention and resources, neither power was willing to confront Japan militarily. On May 7, 1915, Japan delivered an ultimatum: accept the demands within 48 hours or face war. Yuan, knowing China could not defeat Japan, accepted all demands except Group 5 on May 25, 1915. The date became known in China as National Humiliation Day, a rallying point for Chinese nationalism that would shape Sino-Japanese relations for decades. The 21 demands marked a crucial turning point. Japan had overreached, damaging its reputation and creating lasting resentment. Chinese students and intellectuals organized boycotts of Japanese goods. Anti-Japanese sentiment, which had been building since the annexation of Korea, became a mass movement. More importantly, the United States and Britain began to view Japan not as a useful ally, but as a potential threat to their interests in Asia. The demands revealed that Japan saw itself not as one power among many, but as the natural hegemon of East Asia, entitled to dominate China and exclude Western influence. This vision would bring Japan into conflict with powers that had very different ideas about Asia's future. The Russian Revolution of 1917 presented Japan with new opportunities and challenges. When the Bolsheviks seized power and withdrew Russia from the war, Allied leaders feared that German and Austrian prisoners held in Siberia might be armed and turned against them. They also hoped to reopen an eastern front against Germany by supporting anti-Bolshevik forces in Russia's civil war. In July 1918, the Allied powers agreed to intervene in Siberia, with Japan and the United States providing the bulk of the forces. The agreement specified that Japan would contribute roughly the same number of troops as the United States, around 7,000 men. Japan deployed 70,000. Japanese forces occupied Vladivostok and pushed deep into Siberia, far beyond the areas assigned to them. The Siberian intervention revealed both Japan's ambitions and its limits. Japanese military leaders saw Siberia as a potential sphere of influence, a buffer zone against Bolshevism, and a source of resources. But the intervention proved costly and inconclusive. Japanese troops became bogged down fighting both Bolshevik forces and local partisans. The United States and other Allied powers, alarmed by Japan's obvious territorial ambitions, pressured Japan to withdraw. By 1922, facing international criticism and mounting costs, Japan evacuated its forces. The intervention had gained Japan nothing except suspicion from its wartime allies. The end of World War I found Japan in an enviable position. It had gained territory at minimal cost, its economy had boomed, and it sat at the victor's table in Paris. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 offered Japan a chance to secure its gains and claim recognition as a great power. Japanese delegates arrived with two main objectives: to keep the former German territories in Shandong and the Pacific Islands, and to secure international recognition of racial equality. They achieved the first and failed at the second, a failure that would rankle for decades. Japan's claim to Shandong sparked fierce opposition from Chinese delegates, who argued that the province should be returned to China, not transferred to Japan. The United States supported China's position, seeing Japan's control of Shandong as incompatible with the open-door policy and Chinese sovereignty. But Japan had leverage. During the war, Japan had signed secret treaties with Britain, France, and Italy, all of which had agreed to support Japan's claims to German possessions. Faced with these agreements and Japanese threats to withdraw from the conference, the Western powers capitulated. The Treaty of Versailles awarded Shandong to Japan, though Japan agreed to eventually return sovereignty to China while retaining economic privileges. The racial equality clause proved more contentious. Japanese delegate Konoe Fumimaro proposed that the League of Nations covenant include a statement affirming the equality of all races. The proposal was carefully worded, seeking only a declaration of principle rather than any binding commitments. Even so, it threatened existing racial hierarchies. Australia and other dominions fiercely opposed it, fearing it would undermine their immigration restrictions. The United States also opposed it, concerned about its own immigration laws and segregation policies. When the proposal came to a vote, 11 of 17 delegates supported it. But Conference Chairman Woodrow Wilson ruled that such an important matter required unanimous consent. The racial equality clause died, a bitter defeat for Japan that many Japanese saw as evidence that Western powers would never truly accept Japan as an equal. Despite this humiliation, Japan joined the League of Nations as one of 4 permanent members of the League Council, alongside Britain, France, and Italy. Japan's inclusion represented recognition of its status as a great power. Throughout the 1920s, Japan would be an active League member, participating in disarmament conferences, supporting League peacekeeping efforts, and generally cooperating with the Western powers. This cooperation reflected a genuine strand of internationalist thinking among Japan's political elite, particularly those associated with the major political parties. These leaders believed Japan's interests were best served by working within the international system rather than defying it. Yet, even as Japan embraced internationalism, domestic tensions were building. In August 1918, while the war still raged in Europe, Japan experienced the Rice Riots, one of the most significant popular uprisings in modern Japanese history. The immediate cause was rice hoarding and speculation in anticipation of the Siberian intervention, which drove rice prices to unprecedented levels. But the riots reflected deeper frustrations: wartime inflation, unequal distribution of wartime profits, and resentment of the wealthy zaibatsu and landlords who had profited enormously while ordinary Japanese struggled. The riots began in fishing villages in Toyama Prefecture, where women protested rice shipments being sent to cities while local people starved. Within weeks, the unrest spread to cities across Japan. Over 700,000 people participated in protests, strikes, and violent confrontations with police. Rioters attacked rice shops, warehouses, and the homes of wealthy merchants. The government deployed 30,000 troops to restore order, marking the first time the Japanese military had been used on such a scale for domestic crowd control. Over 8,000 people were arrested, though the courts treated most leniently, recognizing the popular sympathy for the rioters' grievances. The rice riots shocked Japan's leadership and forced political changes. The government of Terauchi Masatake fell, unable to contain the unrest. Emperor Taisho issued an imperial ordinance calling for a restoration of peace and urging citizens to work together. More significantly, for the first time in Japanese history, the Genro appointed a commoner, Hara Takashi of the Seiukai Party, as prime minister. Hara's appointment in 1918 marked the beginning of what historians call Taisho democracy, a period when political parties gained real power, and Japan seemed to be evolving toward genuine parliamentary government. Hara Takashi was a pragmatic politician who understood that Japan needed to adapt to changing times. He expanded the electorate by lowering the tax requirement for voting, though suffrage still remained limited to property-owning males. He invested in infrastructure, building roads, railways, and harbors to support Japan's growing economy. He cultivated good relations with the military by appointing Tanaka Giichi, a general who appreciated the importance of civilian government, as army minister. But Hara also faced the fundamental problems that would plague all Taisho governments: inflation, labor unrest, the challenge of absorbing Western ideas while maintaining Japanese traditions, and the question of how to balance expansion abroad with stability at home. The 1920s brought growing political participation and social change. Labor unions organized and grew more militant, leading strikes that paralyzed industries. Socialist and communist parties formed, though they faced constant government harassment. Women's rights activists demanded suffrage and legal equality, though they would not achieve these goals until after World War II. Students and intellectuals debated democracy, Marxism, and Japan's place in the world. Tokyo and Osaka became cosmopolitan cities where Western fashions, music, and ideas competed with traditional Japanese culture. The Ginza district in Tokyo sparkled with department stores, cafes, and movie theaters. Western-style buildings replaced traditional architecture in city centers. This was an era of Mobo and Moga, modern boys and modern girls, young urbanites who embraced Western fashion and culture, shocking their conservative elders. Yet this democratic flowering remained fragile. The Meiji Constitution had created a system where real power remained ambiguous. The Diet could pass laws and approve budgets, but the emperor appointed the prime minister, not the Diet. The military reported directly to the emperor, not to the civilian government. The House of Peers, appointed rather than elected, could block legislation. The Privy Council, composed of elder statesmen, could veto treaties and important decisions. This constitutional ambiguity meant that parliamentary government depended on the willingness of these various power centers to cooperate. When they chose not to cooperate, democracy was helpless. In 1921, Hara Takashi was assassinated by a right-wing fanatic at Tokyo Station. His death began a pattern that would recur throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. Political violence against leaders seen as too liberal, too willing to compromise with foreign powers, or insufficiently devoted to traditional Japanese values. Hara's successors continued to promote party government, but they ruled in an increasingly hostile environment where nationalists, militarists, and conservatives questioned whether democracy served Japan's interests. The international environment of the early 1920s offered both opportunities and constraints for Japanese policy. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922 brought representatives from 9 nations to discuss naval limitation and East Asian security. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes stunned the conference by proposing dramatic cuts in naval construction and a 10-year moratorium on building capital ships. After months of negotiation, 5 powers signed the Washington Naval Treaty, establishing a ratio of capital ship tonnage. Britain and the United States would each maintain 500,000 tons, Japan 300,000 tons, and France and Italy 175,000 tons each. The 553 ratio provoked fierce debate in Japan. Many naval officers felt humiliated, arguing that Japan deserved a 10-10-7 ratio at minimum. They calculated that anything less left Japan vulnerable to the United States. But Admiral Kato Tomosaburo, head of the Japanese delegation, recognized that Japan could not win an arms race with America. Japan's industrial capacity was perhaps 1/10 that of the United States. An unrestricted naval competition would bankrupt Japan while barely straining American resources. The treaty at least guaranteed Japan's regional dominance. Article 19 prohibited Britain, America, and Japan from building new fortifications in the Western Pacific, which meant that American bases in the Philippines could not be strengthened and Britain could not fortify Singapore further. This gave Japan effective control of the Western Pacific, since the United States could not quickly project power across the ocean without nearby bases. The 4-Power Treaty replaced the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which had been Japan's most important diplomatic relationship since 1902. The alliance's termination disappointed many Japanese, who saw it as proof that Britain now preferred America to Japan. The new treaty bound the United States, Britain, Japan, and France to respect each other's Pacific possessions and to consult in case of disputes. It was far weaker than the old alliance, providing no guarantee of mutual defense. But it satisfied American concerns about being drawn into conflicts through the Anglo-Japanese alliance, while giving Japan a degree of international legitimacy. Most significant for China was the 9-Power Treaty, which committed all signatories to respect Chinese territorial integrity and sovereignty, and to maintain the open-door policy. Japan agreed to return Shandong to China, though Japanese companies retained economic privileges there. The treaty marked a retreat from the aggressive policy of the 21 demands. Japan accepted, at least nominally, that China's independence should be respected, and that all powers should have equal commercial access to China. This shift reflected both international pressure and domestic politics. The government led by Kato Takaaki and Foreign Minister Shidehara Kijuro pursued what became known as Shidehara diplomacy: cooperative relations with the Western powers, respect for international law, and peaceful economic expansion rather than military adventurism. Shidehara diplomacy dominated Japanese foreign policy for most of the 1920s. Shidehara believed that Japan's prosperity depended on peaceful trade and good relations with Britain and America. He opposed military interventions in China, arguing they damaged Japan's international reputation and endangered profitable commerce. When Chinese nationalist forces threatened Japanese interests in China, Shidehara restrained the military from responding forcefully. He accepted the Washington Treaty System, even though it limited Japanese power, because he believed the alternatives were worse. This internationalist policy had genuine support among Japanese business leaders who profited from trade with China and the West, and among urban liberals who admired Western democracy. But it faced fierce opposition from the military and from conservative nationalists who believed Japan was surrendering its hard-won position in Asia to appease Western powers. Army officers stationed in Manchuria, where Japan controlled the South Manchurian Railway and maintained a garrison, chafed under civilian control that prevented them from responding to Chinese nationalism. Navy officers resented the Washington Treaty ratios and the budget cuts that followed from arms limitation. Conservative intellectuals condemned the adoption of Western culture and the erosion of traditional Japanese values. In 1925, the government passed 2 laws that reflected these tensions. The Universal Manhood Suffrage Law abolished all property requirements for voting, expanding the electorate from about 3 million to roughly 12.5 million men. It represented a major advance for democracy and popular participation in government, but the same Diet session that passed universal suffrage also passed the Peace Preservation Law, which criminalized organizations that advocated changing the national polity or abolishing private property. The law targeted communists and radical socialists, but was vague enough to be used against any dissent the government deemed dangerous. Those convicted could face up to 10 years in prison. The combination of these two laws symbolized Taisho democracy's fundamental contradiction: expanding political participation while suppressing ideologies the elite found threatening. The economy boomed through most of the 1920s, though unevenly. Heavy industry expanded as Japan built ships, produced steel, and manufactured machinery. Japanese companies competed successfully in Asian markets, underselling Western manufacturers. But agriculture stagnated. Rice prices fell due to good harvests and competition from colonial Taiwan and Korea, where Japanese companies had established large-scale rice production. Rural debt increased as farmers struggled to meet their expenses. The gap between urban and rural Japan, between industrial workers and peasants, between the wealthy Zaibatsu families and everyone else, grew ever wider. The Great Kanto earthquake of September 1st, 1923, exposed these social fissures in horrifying ways. The earthquake, measuring 7.9 in magnitude, struck at midday when many families were cooking lunch over open flames. Fires swept through Tokyo and Yokohama, built largely of wood. Over 140,000 people died, most from the fires rather than the earthquake itself. The disaster destroyed much of Tokyo, left millions homeless, and caused economic damage equivalent to nearly a third of Japan's GDP. In the chaos following the earthquake, vigilante groups and police massacred thousands of Koreans and hundreds of Chinese residents, as well as Japanese socialists and labor organizers. Rumors spread that Koreans were poisoning wells and committing arson. These rumors were entirely false, but they tapped into deep-seated prejudices against Koreans who faced systematic discrimination in Japan. The massacres revealed the dark underside of Japanese nationalism, the belief that foreigners and leftists threatened the nation and could be eliminated with impunity. The government, embarrassed by international attention to the massacres, eventually acknowledged that the rumors had been false, but no one was seriously punished for the killings. The earthquake provided an opportunity to rebuild Tokyo as a modern city. New building codes mandated earthquake-resistant construction. Wide boulevards replaced narrow streets. Parks and open spaces were created as fire breaks. Western-style buildings in concrete and steel rose from the ruins. Yet reconstruction also displaced thousands of poor residents from central Tokyo, pushing them to the margins. The new Tokyo was more modern and more segregated by class than the old city had been. Through the mid-1920s, party politics became increasingly institutionalized. The Seiukai and Kensekai, later renamed Minseido, alternated in power in what historians call the era of party cabinets. From 1924 to 1932, every prime minister except one came from one of these two parties and commanded a majority in the Diet. This represented genuine progress toward parliamentary democracy. The parties competed for votes, promised reforms, and had to answer to the electorate. Universal male suffrage meant that elections involved mass participation and genuine political competition. Yet the parties remained deeply flawed. Both were closely tied to specific Zaibatsu conglomerates, raising questions about who they truly represented. The Seiukai had close ties to Mitsui, the Minseido to Mitsubishi. Corruption was endemic, with politicians accepting bribes in exchange for favorable legislation and government contracts. Rural voters were often controlled by landlords who dictated their political choices. Most fundamentally, the parties could not control the military. The army and navy remained constitutionally independent, reporting to the emperor rather than the cabinet. When military leaders disagreed with civilian policy, they could simply refuse to cooperate, and there was little the civilian government could do about it. The late 1920s brought new challenges. China was unifying under Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, which was determined to end foreign privileges and reassert Chinese sovereignty. Chinese nationalists attacked foreign residents, seized control of foreign-dominated areas, and demanded the return of territories held by foreign powers. This Chinese nationalism threatened Japanese interests directly, particularly in Manchuria, where Japan had invested heavily since the Russo-Japanese War. The Nationalist Northern Expedition, a military campaign to unite China under nationalist control, reached Manchuria in 1928. Japanese military leaders, particularly the Kwantung Army stationed in Manchuria to protect the South Manchurian Railway, saw this as an intolerable threat. In June 1928, officers of the Kwantung Army assassinated Zhang Zuolin, the Chinese warlord who controlled Manchuria, by bombing his train. They hoped the assassination would trigger chaos that would justify Japanese military intervention. The plot failed when Zhang's son, Zhang Xueliang, took control and aligned himself with Chiang's nationalists, rather than fragmenting into chaos. Prime Minister Tanaka Giichi, himself a former general, initially tried to hold the perpetrators accountable, but the army closed ranks, protecting the officers involved. When Tanaka attempted to explain the situation to Emperor Hirohito, the emperor expressed displeasure at the military's insubordination. Tanaka, humiliated, resigned. The incident established a dangerous precedent. The military could commit unauthorized acts, including assassinations, and face no serious punishment. Civilian government could not control the army. The constitutional system that gave the military independence from civilian authority meant that when officers chose to defy their own high command, there was no mechanism to stop them. The assassination of Zhang Zuolin marked the beginning of the end for Taisho democracy. The political parties had failed to establish real control over the military. The international system created by the Washington Conference was fraying as Chinese nationalism challenged the status quo. The economic prosperity of the 1920s was about to collapse with the onset of the Great Depression, and the military officers who had gotten away with murdering a foreign leader learned that audacious action, even when unauthorized, could achieve objectives that cautious diplomacy could not. By 1930, Japan stood at a crossroads. It had achieved much since 1910, territorial gains in China and the Pacific, recognition as a great power, economic growth, and progress toward democracy. Japanese cities hummed with modern industry. Japanese ships sailed the world's oceans. Japanese goods competed successfully in international markets. Japanese diplomats sat as equals with Western powers in international conferences. Yet, beneath this surface success, fundamental problems remained unresolved. The military was growing restless under civilian control and arms limitation treaties. Rural Japan suffered while cities prospered. The parties that governed Japan were widely seen as corrupt and beholden to wealthy interests. Chinese nationalism threatened Japanese positions in China that had been won through decades of effort and sacrifice. Most dangerously, a crucial question remained unanswered. What kind of power would Japan become? Would it continue Shidehara's policy of cooperation with the West and peaceful expansion, accepting constraints on its power in exchange for prosperity and international legitimacy? Or would it pursue the vision of empire that had driven the 21 demands, seeing Asia as Japan's natural sphere of influence to be dominated regardless of Western objections or Chinese resistance? For most of the 1920s, internationalists had won this debate. But they had not silenced their opponents, and events would soon shift the balance decisively against them. The stage was set for the disasters of the 1930s, when Japan would make its choice, and that choice would lead to catastrophe. The night of September 18, 1931, changed everything. At approximately 10:20 p.m., a small explosion occurred on the tracks of the South Manchurian Railway just north of Mukden. The blast was so weak that a train passed over the damaged track minutes later, without incident. Yet this minor explosion, deliberately set by Japanese officers as a pretext for military action, would trigger the collapse of the international order established after World War I and set Japan on a path toward total war. Within hours, the Kwantung Army, Japan's force stationed in Manchuria to protect the railway zone, had seized Mukden and begun operations throughout southern Manchuria. Within months, Japan controlled all of Manchuria. Within 6 years, Japan would be fighting an all-out war with China. The Mukden incident marked the moment when the Japanese military broke free from civilian control and began making its own foreign policy through violence. The conspiracy had been brewing for months. Lieutenant Colonel Ishiwara Kanji and Colonel Itagaki Seishiro, staff officers of the Kwantung Army, planned the operation meticulously. They believed that Manchuria's resources were essential to Japan's survival, that Chinese nationalism threatened Japanese interests, and that the civilian government in Tokyo was too weak and too accommodating to protect those interests. The assassination of Zhang Zuolin in 1928 had failed to destabilize Manchuria as they had hoped. Jiang's son, Zhang Shuiliang, had taken control and aligned himself with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. Now, the Kwantung Army officers decided to manufacture a crisis that would justify outright military occupation. Captain Kawamoto Suemori of the 29th Infantry Regiment placed the explosives near the railway tracks. The blast was carefully calibrated to cause minimal damage while appearing significant enough to justify retaliation. Japanese troops immediately attacked the nearby Chinese garrison, claiming they were responding to Chinese aggression. The Chinese troops, numbering around 7,000 and commanded by officers who had orders not to resist Japanese provocations, withdrew without fighting seriously. By dawn on September 19th, Japanese forces controlled Mukden. General Honjo Shigeru, commander of the Kwantung Army, ordered his forces to expand operations throughout Manchuria, directly defying explicit orders from Tokyo to localize the incident. The civilian government, led by Prime Minister Wakatsuki Reijiro, was caught completely off guard. The cabinet immediately issued a non-expansion policy, ordering the army to cease operations and withdraw to the railway zone. The Kwantung Army ignored these orders. Foreign Minister Shidehara Kijuro assured Western diplomats that Japan would not expand the conflict and that the troops would soon withdraw. These assurances meant nothing. Reinforcements arrived from Korea, where Japanese commanders transferred an entire division to Manchuria without authorization from Tokyo. Within weeks, Japanese forces controlled all major cities in southern Manchuria. By the end of 1931, they had seized northern Manchuria as well, including the city of Harbin. The government's impotence shocked the Japanese public and politicians. Prime Minister Wakatsuki could not control his own army. The military had constitutional independence, reporting directly to the emperor rather than through the civilian government. When field commanders chose to disobey their own high command, there was no mechanism to stop them. The army minister, General Minami Jiro, sympathized with the Kwantung Army's actions, even as he nominally supported the non-expansion policy. The emperor expressed concern, but took no decisive action. The institutional structures created by the Meiji Constitution, which had seemed to balance civilian and military authority effectively, revealed themselves as fatally flawed when military officers decided to act independently. International reaction proved equally impotent. China appealed to the League of Nations, which sent a commission of inquiry led by British diplomat Lord Lytton. The commission spent months investigating, interviewing witnesses, and examining evidence. They traveled throughout Manchuria, observing Japanese military control and the puppet government Japan was establishing. The Lytton Report, published in October 1932, concluded that the Mukden incident had been staged by Japanese officers, that the subsequent military occupation violated international law and the Covenant of the League, and that Manchukuo, the puppet state Japan had created, was not genuinely independent, but rather a Japanese colony. The report urged that Manchuria be returned to Chinese sovereignty, while recognizing legitimate Japanese economic interests in the region. The League of Nations adopted the Lytton Report in February 1933. Japan's response was to walk out of the League and never return. The organization that had been created to prevent aggressive war had proven powerless to stop it. Japan faced no serious consequences for its defiance. The United States issued the Stimson Doctrine, stating it would not recognize territorial changes achieved by force, but refused to impose sanctions or take any concrete action. Britain and France, preoccupied with their own economic crises and unwilling to risk war with Japan, accepted the fait accompli. The lesson was clear. A determined power willing to use military force could seize territory with impunity. Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini took note. The conquest of Manchuria transformed Japanese politics. The Kwantung Army officers became heroes to many Japanese. Newspapers celebrated their audacity and patriotism. The public, suffering through the Great Depression, welcomed news of military victories and territorial expansion. Rural areas, hit especially hard by falling agricultural prices, supplied many of the army's conscripts and supported military action enthusiastically. The conquest seemed to validate the military's argument that Japan needed to secure resources and markets in continental Asia to survive economically. Manchuria was rich in coal, iron, and agricultural land. Its development, the military argued, would solve Japan's economic problems. The Wakatsuki government fell in December 1931, unable to control the military or manage the crisis. It was replaced by a government led by Inukai Tsuyoshi of the Seiyukai Party. Inukai was an experienced politician who understood the danger posed by military insubordination. He attempted to work with the emperor to reassert civilian control over the army, but Inukai faced an impossible situation. The Kwantung Army continued expanding operations in Manchuria and into Jehol province despite government orders. In January 1932, Japanese forces manufactured another incident in Shanghai, attacking Chinese positions and occupying parts of the city to divert international attention from Manchuria. The Shanghai incident involved heavy fighting and caused thousands of Chinese and Japanese casualties before a ceasefire was brokered in May. On March 1, 1932, the Kwantung Army declared the independence of Manchukuo, a new state supposedly created by the people of Manchuria to govern themselves. The facade was transparent. Japanese officers selected Puyi, the last Qing emperor who had abdicated in 1912, as Manchukuo's chief executive, later declaring him emperor. Japanese advisors controlled every government ministry. The Kwantung Army commander served as Japan's ambassador to Manchukuo, but in reality ran the state. Japanese companies received monopolies over major industries. Japanese settlers were encouraged to migrate to Manchukuo to exploit its agricultural potential. Manchukuo was a colony in everything but name, a Japanese puppet state created to legitimize military conquest. The political violence that had been building since the late 1920s reached a crescendo in May 1932. On May 15th, a group of young naval officers, aided by Army cadets and civilian ultranationalists, launched a coordinated attack on multiple targets in Tokyo. They murdered Prime Minister Inukai in his official residence, shooting him after he tried to speak with them. His last words were reportedly, "If we could talk, you would understand." The assassins replied, "Dialogue is useless." They also attacked the headquarters of the Seiyukai Party, threw grenades at Mitsubishi Bank, and attempted to destroy electrical substations to plunge Tokyo into darkness. The plot even included plans to murder Charlie Chaplin, who was visiting Japan at the time, calculating that his death would provoke American anger and provide an excuse for war. The May 15th incident ended the era of party government. No party politician would serve as prime minister again until after World War II. The assassins surrendered to police and were tried for murder. Their trial became a public spectacle. They testified about their patriotic motives, their concern for starving farmers, their disgust with corrupt politicians and greedy zaibatsu. Thousands of petitions flooded the court, demanding leniency. Some petitioners sent letters written in blood. Others sent severed fingers as symbols of dedication. The assassins were portrayed as sincere patriots acting from pure motives, however misguided their methods. The court-martial sentenced the ringleaders to only 4 years' imprisonment. None served their full sentences. The leniency shown to political assassins had catastrophic consequences. It demonstrated that violence against civilian leaders would be tolerated, even celebrated, if perpetrators claimed patriotic motives. It showed that the courts and the government could not or would not protect politicians who tried to restrain the military. Any politician who opposed military expansion now faced not just political opposition, but potential assassination. The rule of law, already weakened by military insubordination, collapsed further. Political debate increasingly occurred under the shadow of violence. The government that replaced Inukai's was led by Admiral Saito Makoto, a respected military figure. This began a pattern where retired admirals or generals served as prime ministers, theoretically mediating between the military services and civilian politicians, but in practice unable to control the armed forces. The military services gained effective veto power over government formation through a regulation that only active duty generals and admirals could serve as Army and Navy ministers. If the services refused to appoint ministers, no government could be formed. If ministers resigned, the government fell. This constitutional arrangement, combined with the climate of intimidation created by political violence, meant the military increasingly dictated policy. The Great Depression deepened Japan's economic crisis and radicalized political discourse. Between 1929 and 1931, Industrial production fell by roughly 20%. Unemployment soared. The silk industry, Japan's major export sector, collapsed when American and European consumers stopped buying luxury goods. Silk prices fell to one-fifth their 1920s levels. Rural areas suffered terribly as agricultural prices fell even faster than industrial prices. Farmers could not meet their debt payments or tax obligations. Rural poverty became desperate. Stories circulated of farmers selling daughters to brothels to pay debts. These conditions created fertile ground for radical ideologies. Young military officers, many from rural backgrounds, were particularly affected. They blamed corrupt politicians, greedy zaibatsu, and foreign influences for Japan's suffering. They developed ideologies that mixed nationalism, imperialism, anti-capitalism, and a mystical devotion to the emperor. They read works by theorists like Kida Iki, who advocated a Showa restoration that would overthrow the existing power structure, abolish political parties and zaibatsu monopolies, and create a direct link between the emperor and the people. They organized secret societies within the military to plan coups and assassinations. They corresponded with civilian ultranationalists who shared their vision of a militarized, expansionist Japan purged of corrupting Western influences. The military itself was divided into factions with competing visions of Japan's future. The Kodoha, or Imperial Way faction, led by Generals Araki Sadao and Masaki Jinzaburo, advocated immediate war with the Soviet Union, spiritual training over technological modernization, and direct action to purge corrupt influences from government. The Toseiha, or Control faction, associated with General Nagata Tetsuzan, favored careful preparation for eventual war, emphasis on industrial mobilization and modern technology, and working within existing structures to increase military influence over policy. Both factions agreed that Japan needed to expand militarily, and that civilian politicians could not be trusted to pursue a sufficiently aggressive policy. They disagreed primarily over tactics and timing. These factional disputes sometimes turned violent. In August 1935, Lieutenant Colonel Aizawa Saburo of the Kodoha faction walked into General Nagata's office and hacked him to death with a sword, believing Nagata responsible for the demotion of Kodoha leaders. Aizawa's trial became another platform for radical ideology, with the defendant and his lawyers using the courtroom to denounce military and civilian leaders they considered insufficiently patriotic. The trial inflamed tensions between the factions and radicalized younger officers who sympathized with Aizawa's motives, if not his methods. The Kodoha's frustration came to a head on February 26, 1936. Early that snowy morning, approximately 1,400 troops from the 1st Division, led by young officers of the Kodoha faction, launched a coordinated coup attempt in Tokyo. They seized the central government district, occupying the War Ministry, police headquarters, and the Diet Building. Death squads attacked the homes of leading officials. They murdered Finance Minister Takahashi Korekiyo, who had been trying to restrain military spending. They killed Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Saito Makoto, the former prime minister who had tried to mediate between factions. They murdered Inspector General of Military Education, Watanabe Jotaro, a Toseiha leader. They attacked Admiral Suzuki Kantaro, who survived despite being shot multiple times. They narrowly missed Prime Minister Okeda Keisuke, who escaped by hiding while his brother-in-law was killed in his place. The rebels issued a manifesto denouncing elder statesmen, financial oligarchs, and military bureaucrats for corrupting the nation. They called for a Showa restoration that would purge these evil influences and restore direct imperial rule. They demanded that their chosen leaders, including General Masaki, be appointed to key positions. They expected other army units to join them, and the government to negotiate. For 3 days, the rebels controlled central Tokyo, while the government, the military high command, and the imperial court debated how to respond. Emperor Hirohito's reaction proved decisive. The emperor, normally a passive figure who followed his advisor's guidance, was furious at this attack on his chosen officials. He demanded the rebellion be suppressed immediately. He threatened to lead loyalist forces himself if the army would not act. This imperial anger forced the military's hand. The War Ministry, initially sympathetic to the rebels' motives, issued orders for them to return to barracks. When the rebels refused, loyalist forces surrounded them. naval vessels moved into position to bombard the rebel-held districts if necessary. Facing overwhelming force and lacking the imperial support they had hoped for, the rebels surrendered on February 29th. The government finally responded to military insubordination with severity. 19 leaders of the coup were court-martialed in closed proceedings and executed by firing squad. Dozens more were imprisoned. Kita Iki, the civilian theorist whose writings had inspired the rebels, was also executed despite not participating directly in the coup. The harsh punishment sent a message that the government would not tolerate direct challenges to the emperor's authority. But the suppression of the February 26th incident did not restore civilian control. Instead, it consolidated military power in different hands. The Toseha faction emerged triumphant from the crisis. The Kodoha was purged from positions of influence, but the Toseha officers who now dominated the military were no less committed to expansion and military supremacy over civilian government. They were simply more calculating and bureaucratic in their approach. They preferred to work through institutions rather than launch coups, to manipulate the system rather than overthrow it. General Terauchi Hisaichi, appointed army minister after the incident, demonstrated the military's increased power by interfering in cabinet appointments. When Prime Minister Hirota Koki tried to select ministers the military opposed, Terauchi simply refused to accept them. Hirota capitulated. This established a pattern where the military services effectively controlled government composition. The military also secured reinstatement of the regulation that only active duty officers could serve as Army and Navy ministers. This regulation had been in place until 1913, then abolished, then reinstated after the February 26th incident. It gave the services absolute veto power over government formation. If the army refused to appoint a war minister, no government could be formed. If the war minister resigned in protest of government policy, the government fell unless the army appointed a replacement. Between 1936 and 1941, this power was used repeatedly to force governments to adopt aggressive policies or to bring down governments that resisted military demands. China policy became the focus of military-civilian conflict. In northern China, Japanese forces stationed near Beijing to guard treaty rights under the Boxer Protocol engaged in constant provocations and territorial encroachments. Local Japanese commanders negotiated directly with Chinese warlords, signed agreements that expanded Japanese control and created autonomous zones nominally ruled by Chinese puppets, but actually controlled by Japanese officers. The foreign ministry and civilian politicians worried these actions would provoke full-scale war with China, something Japan was not ready for, economically or militarily. But the military argued that Chinese nationalism, particularly Chiang Kai-shek's campaign to unify China and end foreign privileges, threatened Japanese interests and had to be resisted. By 1937, Japan stood at the edge of the abyss. The military-dominated government, civilian politicians cowered in fear of assassination, the economy struggled despite Manchukuo's resources, and China policy grew increasingly aggressive. The London Naval Treaty, which Japan had accepted in 1930 amid fierce domestic opposition, expired in 1936. Japan declined to renew naval limitation agreements, launching a massive naval expansion program it could barely afford. Relations with the Western powers deteriorated as Japan withdrew from international agreements and pursued unilateral expansion. Domestically, the government suppressed leftist movements ruthlessly while tolerating and often encouraging right-wing ultranationalism. The Peace Preservation Law, originally passed in 1925 to target communists, was expanded and used to arrest anyone suspected of dangerous thoughts. Special Higher Police, the Toko, conducted surveillance, infiltrated organizations, and arrested thousands. Universities were purged of liberal professors. The publications were censored heavily. The government promoted Kokutai ideology. The belief in Japan's unique national essence centered on reverence for the emperor and dedication to the state. Schools indoctrinated students with nationalist and militarist ideology. The military's influence extended into civilian life through reservist associations, youth organizations, and patriotic societies that promoted military values and monitored local communities for signs of disloyalty. Yet, Japanese society remained more complex and contradictory than simple narratives of militarization suggest. Tokyo and other cities still had vibrant cultural scenes. Jazz clubs operated alongside nationalist rallies. Western films remained popular even as the government promoted traditional values. Department stores sold both kimonos and Western fashions. Intellectuals debated Marxism and liberalism despite government repression. Labor unions, though under constant pressure, continued organizing workers. The great Zaibatsu families, supposedly enemies of the military radicals, actually profited enormously from military expansion and industrial mobilization. They built the factories, produced the weapons, and financed the conquests that military leaders demanded. Manchukuo itself became a laboratory for Japanese imperialism. The Kwantung Army developed ambitious plans to transform Manchuria into an industrial powerhouse that would make Japan self-sufficient in strategic resources. They established the South Manchurian Railway Company as the primary development agency, giving it vast powers to build industries, construct infrastructure, and govern territory. Japanese engineers designed new cities like Mshinking, the Manchukuo capital, with wide boulevards, modern architecture, and advanced urban planning. They built steel mills, chemical plants, and munitions factories. They developed coal and iron mines. They constructed thousands of miles of railway. This development required immense capital investment and imported technology. It also required labor, which was extracted through increasingly coercive means from the Chinese population. Japanese settlers received preferential treatment and the best land. Chinese farmers were displaced, forced to work on Japanese-controlled farms, or conscripted for construction projects. Korean migrants, fleeing poverty and repression in Japanese-controlled Korea, formed another source of cheap labor. The brutality of colonial rule in Manchuria would intensify throughout the 1930s as the Kwantung Army built the infrastructure and industrial capacity it believed essential for future wars. By mid-1937, Japan had traveled far from the internationalist optimism of the 1920s. The military had seized control of foreign policy through a combination of insubordination, assassination, and constitutional manipulation. The democratic institutions of the Taisho era survived in form but had been hollowed out in substance. The international order created by the Washington Conference had collapsed. Japan had withdrawn from the League of Nations, abandoned naval limitation treaties, and established a colonial empire in Manchuria through naked aggression. The stage was set for the conflict that would consume China and eventually drag Japan into total war against Britain, the United States, and the other Allied powers. The period from 1931 to 1937 represented a fundamental transformation in Japanese politics and society. The liberal, internationalist strand of Japanese thought that had competed with militarism and ultranationalism through the 1920s was defeated utterly. The Zaibatsu and political parties that had seemed to dominate Japanese life accepted military supremacy rather than resist it. The emperor, who might have used his authority to restrain the military, chose largely not to intervene, except when military factions directly challenged his authority. The institutional structures created by the Meiji Constitution, which had allowed Japan to modernize while maintaining authoritarian control, now facilitated military domination while providing a veneer of constitutional legitimacy. Most tragically, the Japanese people, or at least significant portions of them, supported this transformation. They celebrated military victories, accepted censorship and repression, embraced nationalist ideology, and prepared for war. The democratic values and international cooperation that had characterized the 1920s gave way to militarism, authoritarianism, and imperial expansion. Japan had chosen its path, and that path led directly to the invasion of China in July 1937, the beginning of 8 years of total war that would devastate East Asia and ultimately destroy the empire that Japanese leaders believed they were building. The shot that started the 8-year war between Japan and China may never have been fired at all. On the evening of July 7, 1937, Japanese troops conducting night exercises near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing claimed a soldier had gone missing. They demanded entry to the nearby walled town of Wanping to search for him. Chinese garrison troops, commanded by officers who had been ordered to avoid provocations, refused permission. Someone fired a shot in the darkness. Both sides opened fire. by dawn, what should have been a minor incident that diplomats could resolve had escalated into combat. The missing soldier had returned to his unit within hours, but it no longer mattered. The Japanese military had found its pretext. Within weeks, Japan would be fighting a full-scale war in China, a war that Japanese leaders confidently predicted would last 3 months, but which would instead consume 8 years, cost millions of lives, and ultimately drag Japan into global conflict against powers it could not defeat. Neither government in Tokyo nor Nanjing wanted general war in July 1937. The Japanese government, led by Prince Konoe Fumimaro, initially ordered the military to contain the incident. But, as in Manchuria 6 years earlier, field commanders ignored these orders. The Kwantung Army in Manchuria dispatched reinforcements to northern China without authorization. The Japanese garrison in northern China, emboldened by years of successful intimidation, attacked Chinese positions. Within days, what both governments called the China Incident had become undeniable warfare. The Japanese captured Beijing on July 28th and Tianjin 2 days later, securing control of northern China with shocking speed. Chinese resistance proved ineffective, ill-equipped and poorly led. Chinese troops retreated in disarray. Chiang Kai-shek faced an agonizing decision. His nationalist government had spent the previous decade fighting communist insurgents and regional warlords rather than preparing for war with Japan. His best divisions were positioned to fight other Chinese, not foreign invaders. The Chinese military was divided among competing commanders with questionable loyalty to the central government. Chinese industry was primitive compared to Japan's. China produced almost no modern weapons, relying on imports that would be difficult to obtain once war began. Every rational calculation suggested that China could not win a war with Japan. Yet Chiang also understood that further retreats and humiliations would destroy his government's legitimacy. Chinese nationalism had been building for decades, fueled by Japanese encroachments and the 21 demands. The United Front Agreement Chiang had recently signed with the Communists, ending a decade of civil war, was premised on resistance to Japan. If Chiang surrendered northern China without fighting, his own people might overthrow him. On August 13, 1937, Chinese forces attacked Japanese positions in Shanghai, China's largest city and most important commercial center. The decision to fight in Shanghai rather than northern China was strategic. Shanghai was an international city with large foreign populations, including Americans and Europeans. Fighting there would attract international attention and possibly intervention. The city's urban terrain would also neutralize some Japanese advantages in armor and aircraft. Most importantly, Shanghai was far from Japanese supply lines, while Chinese forces could be reinforced from the interior. Chiang committed his best troops, German-trained divisions equipped with modern weapons, to the battle. The Battle of Shanghai lasted 3 months and became one of the largest and bloodiest urban battles in history. Perhaps 750,000 soldiers fought in an area of just a few square miles. Japanese naval vessels in the Yangtze River bombarded Chinese positions, while Japanese aircraft struck Chinese troops and civilian areas indiscriminately. Chinese soldiers, many wearing only light summer uniforms and carrying obsolete rifles, attacked entrenched Japanese positions in human wave assaults. Entire battalions were annihilated in single attacks. Bodies piled in the streets, buildings burned for days. Civilians trapped in the battle zone died by tens of thousands. The Japanese poured reinforcements into Shanghai, eventually committing over 200,000 troops. Naval aircraft from prayers offshore and bombers from bases in Taiwan and Japan struck Chinese positions repeatedly. Japanese newspapers celebrated each victory, and the public followed the battle with intense interest. But the campaign cost far more than anyone had anticipated. Japanese casualties exceeded 40,000, including many officers and experienced soldiers who were irreplaceable. The battle that was supposed to demonstrate Japanese military superiority instead revealed that China would not collapse quickly. When Chinese forces finally withdrew in November 1937, they remained intact as fighting formations, retreating up the Yangtze River toward the capital at Nanjing. The Japanese had won, but at terrible cost and with no end to the war in sight. The fall of Shanghai sealed Nanjing's fate. Japanese forces advanced rapidly up the Yangtze, determined to capture the nationalist capital before winter. Chiang Kai-shek, evacuated his government to Wuhan, hundreds of miles up the river. He left behind a garrison commanded by Tang Shengji, with orders to defend the city to the death. Tang assembled roughly 50,000 troops, many of them untrained recruits and soldiers separated from their units during the retreat from Shanghai. These forces lacked adequate weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Most crucially, they had no plan for retreat if the defense failed. When Japanese forces surrounded Nanjing in early December, these troops were trapped. The assault began on December 9, 1937. Japanese artillery bombarded the city's walls, while aircraft struck military and civilian targets. Chinese resistance crumbled quickly. On December 12th, Tang abandoned the city and his troops, fleeing across the Yangtze River. The remaining Chinese soldiers, leaderless and desperate, tried to escape but found few boats. Thousands drowned trying to swim the river. Japanese forces entered Nanjing on December the 13th, encountering minimal organized resistance. What followed shocked the world and became one of the worst atrocities of the war. For 6 weeks, from mid-December 1937 into January 1938, Japanese troops engaged in systematic murder, rape, and destruction in Nanjing. The death toll remains disputed, with estimates ranging from 100,000 to over 300,000 Chinese killed. Chinese soldiers who had surrendered or discarded their uniforms and tried to blend with civilians were hunted down and executed en masse. Japanese troops machine-gunned prisoners by the thousands along the Yangtze's banks. They conducted killing contests, with officers competing to see who could behead the most Chinese with their swords. Newspapers in Japan reported these contests as sporting achievements. The sexual violence was equally systematic and horrific. Japanese soldiers raped tens of thousands of Chinese women, from young girls to elderly women. Rape victims were often murdered afterward, or left so severely injured they died. Families were forced to watch assaults on their relatives. The violence was so widespread and brutal that even Nazi officials in Nanjing expressed shock and horror. John Raab, a German businessman and Nazi party member who had established a safety zone to protect Chinese civilians, documented the atrocities in detailed diaries. He and other foreigners in Nanjing saved perhaps 200,000 Chinese lives by sheltering them in the safety zone, but they could not prevent the massacre occurring throughout the rest of the city. Japanese officers made little effort to stop their troops. Some actively encouraged the violence, believing it would terrorize the Chinese population into submission. Prince Asaka Yasuhiko, a member of the imperial family who commanded forces entering Nanjing, allegedly issued orders to kill all captives. General Matsui Iwane, the overall commander, either could not or would not control his troops. The military police who might have maintained discipline were few in number and often participated in the atrocities themselves. The violence revealed a collapse of military discipline and the dehumanization of the Chinese enemy that had been fostered by years of propaganda portraying Chinese as inferior and subhuman. News of the Nanjing massacre reached the outside world through reports from foreign journalists, missionaries, and diplomats. Western newspapers published accounts of the atrocities, though many readers found them difficult to believe. The Japanese government denied the reports, claiming they were Chinese propaganda. Even today, some Japanese nationalists deny or minimize the massacre, causing ongoing diplomatic tensions with China. But the evidence is overwhelming. Thousands of photographs, hundreds of eyewitness accounts, and the testimony of Japanese soldiers themselves confirmed that Nanjing witnessed one of the most brutal episodes in modern warfare. The atrocity achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than terrorizing the Chinese into surrender, it stiffened resistance. Chinese who might have accepted Japanese occupation after Nanjing refused to contemplate it. The massacre became a rallying cry for Chinese nationalism, proof that Japanese rule meant death and destruction. It also damaged Japan's international reputation irreparably. Americans and Europeans who had been ambivalent about the conflict now saw Japan as a brutal aggressor. The Nanjing massacre made meaningful peace between China and Japan impossible. Any Chinese leader who made peace with Japan after such atrocities would be seen as a traitor. Through 1938, Japanese forces advanced deeper into China, capturing city after city. In October, they took Wuhan, the temporary capital. In the same month, they seized Guangzhou in southern China, cutting off China's main supply route from the outside world. By the end of 1938, Japan controlled most of eastern China, including virtually all major cities and industrial centers. Japanese forces occupied territory containing roughly one-third of China's population. They controlled the railways, the ports, the mines, and the factories. By conventional measures, Japan had won the war, but China refused to surrender. Chiang Kai-shek had moved his government to Chongqing, a city deep in China's interior, protected by mountains and distance from Japanese power. From there, he pursued a strategy of trading space for time. China's vast territory became its greatest asset. Japanese forces could occupy cities and transportation routes, but they could not garrison the countryside or control the rural areas where most Chinese lived. Chinese armies, though defeated in conventional battles, remained in the field. They avoided decisive engagements, retreating when confronted with superior Japanese forces, then returning when the Japanese moved on. The war devolved into a stalemate, with Japan controlling urban centers and communication lines, while Chinese forces, both nationalist and communist, operated in the rural areas. The economic burden of the war strained Japan severely. The military had predicted a quick victory requiring 3 months and minimal expense. Instead, Japan was fighting a war with no end in sight, requiring huge armies that had to be supplied across vast distances in hostile territory. By 1938, Japan had over 1 million troops in China, with more being sent constantly to replace casualties and garrison conquered territory. These troops needed food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment, all of which had to be transported through China's primitive road and rail network while under constant threat from Chinese guerrillas. The war economy distorted Japanese society and politics. Military spending consumed ever larger portions of the national budget, requiring higher taxes and government borrowing that created inflation. Consumer goods became scarce as factories shifted to military production. The government imposed rationing of rice, cloth, and other essentials. Labor shortages developed as more men were drafted. Women and students were mobilized to work in factories and fields. The government promoted campaigns for austerity and sacrifice, urging citizens to endure hardship for the war effort. Political dissent was suppressed ruthlessly. Anyone who questioned the war or suggested negotiations faced arrest by the special police. The puppet regimes Japan established in occupied China proved ineffective. In March 1938, Japan created the reformed government of the Republic of China in Nanjing, headed by Chinese collaborators. In 1940, Wang Jingwei, a former ally of Chiang Kai-shek, defected and established another puppet government, also based in Nanjing, claiming to be the legitimate government of China. These regimes controlled little beyond the territory Japanese troops directly occupied. They commanded no loyalty from the Chinese population, who viewed their leaders as traitors. They provided Japan with fig leaves of legitimacy, but no genuine cooperation from the Chinese people. In the countryside, Japanese occupation forces faced constant guerrilla warfare. Communist forces, led by Mao Zedong, expanded rapidly in northern China, establishing base areas in regions the Japanese could not effectively control. The communists practiced what Mao called People's War, mobilizing peasants to support guerrilla operations through political organization and land reform. Nationalist forces also conducted guerrilla operations, though less effectively than the communists. Japanese troops responded to guerrilla attacks with brutal reprisals, implementing the Three Alls policy, which stood for kill all, burn all, loot all. When guerrillas operated from a village, Japanese forces would massacre the entire population, burn the village, and destroy all crops and livestock. These reprisals killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians, but did not stop the guerrilla campaign. Instead, they drove more Chinese to support the resistance. The war in China increasingly isolated Japan internationally. The League of Nations condemned Japanese aggression, though without imposing meaningful sanctions. The United States, concerned about the threat to American interests in China and the brutal conduct of Japanese forces, began supporting China with loans and then military supplies. The Burma Road, a supply route from British Burma into southwestern China, became China's lifeline, carrying American weapons and supplies to Chinese forces. American public opinion turned sharply against Japan following reports of atrocities and the bombing of civilians. President Franklin Roosevelt gave a famous speech in October 1937 calling for the quarantine of aggressor nations, a barely veiled reference to Japan. Japan's relations with Western powers deteriorated throughout the late 1930s. In December 1937, Japanese aircraft attacked and sank the American gunboat USS Panay on the Yangtze River, killing 3 Americans. Japan apologized and paid compensation, but the incident heightened American anger. Japanese forces repeatedly violated American and British rights in China, attacking their property and sometimes their personnel. Each incident created diplomatic crises and moved Japan closer to conflict with the Western powers, whose trade and resources Japan desperately needed. The resource problem became acute. Japan imported most of its oil, steel, and other strategic materials from the United States and British Empire. The war in China consumed these resources at an alarming rate while producing no economic benefits to offset the costs. Japanese strategists understood that continuing the war in China while remaining dependent on American oil and steel was unsustainable. They needed either to end the war in China through negotiations, which seemed impossible after Nanjing, or to secure alternative sources of raw materials, which meant expanding into Southeast Asia, which would bring conflict with Britain and the United States. The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of August 1939 shocked Japan's leaders. Japan had signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany in 1936, aimed at opposing communism and implicitly creating an alliance against the Soviet Union. Japanese and Soviet forces had clashed on the Manchurian-Mongolian border in 1939 at Nomonhan, where Soviet forces under General Georgy Zhukov inflicted a devastating defeat on Japanese troops. When Hitler then signed a pact with Stalin, Japan felt betrayed. The focus of Japanese strategic thinking shifted. If Germany would not help contain the Soviet Union, and if the war in China showed no signs of ending, Japan needed to look elsewhere for solutions. In September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, formalizing the Axis alliance. The pact committed the 3 powers to mutual defense if any were attacked by a nation not currently involved in the European War or the war in China, a clause clearly aimed at the United States. Japanese leaders hoped the pact would deter American intervention in Asia by threatening the United States with a two-front war. They also hoped German victories in Europe would distract Britain and France, giving Japan a free hand in Southeast Asia. The pact marked Japan's alignment with the fascist powers and its break with the democratic nations that had been its allies in World War I. The fall of France in June 1940 and the German assault on Britain created opportunities Japan could not resist. French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, colonies of defeated or embattled European powers, seemed defenseless. These territories possessed the oil, rubber, tin, and rice that Japan needed. In September 1940, Japan pressured the Vichy French government into allowing Japanese troops to occupy northern Indochina, ostensibly to cut off supplies to China through Indochina. The United States responded with limited sanctions, including restrictions on exports of aviation fuel and scrap iron to Japan. Through 1940 and 1941, tension between Japan and the United States escalated. American support for China increased, with the Roosevelt administration providing loans, military equipment, and eventually volunteer pilots, the famous Flying Tigers, to fight for China. American economic pressure on Japan increased, with broader restrictions on strategic materials. Japanese leaders faced a closing window of opportunity. If they acted quickly, they might seize Southeast Asian resources before the United States could intervene. If they waited, American rearmament and economic pressure would strangle Japan without war. In July 1941, Japan occupied southern Indochina, moving forces into position to threaten British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. The United States responded with a total embargo on oil exports to Japan, joined by Britain and the Netherlands. This embargo was catastrophic for Japan. The country imported 80% of its oil, with most coming from the United States. Japanese oil reserves would last perhaps 18 months at current consumption rates, less if military operations accelerated. Japan faced a choice: withdraw from China and Indochina to get the embargo lifted, which was politically unacceptable and would mean surrendering all gains from 4 years of war, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force, which would mean war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. The war in China, which had consumed 4 years and hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives by mid-1941, had become a trap from which Japan could not escape. Japanese forces controlled vast territories but faced endless guerrilla warfare and persistent Chinese resistance. The war had cost Japan its international reputation, isolated it from the Western powers, and created resource dependence that those powers now weaponized through embargoes. Yet Japanese leaders could not end the war without admitting defeat and abandoning the empire they believed essential to Japan's survival. The military officers who dominated the government would not accept withdrawal, seeing it as a betrayal of the soldiers who had died. Public opinion, shaped by years of propaganda celebrating victories in China, would not tolerate retreat. By late 1941, the China War had created the conditions that would lead Japan to attack Pearl Harbor and initiate the Pacific War. The war had militarized Japanese society completely, crushing any remaining civilian opposition to military dominance. It had committed Japan's military to maintaining an Asian empire regardless of cost. It had demonstrated that Chinese resistance, supported by American and British aid, could deny Japan victory indefinitely. It had created resource shortages that made Japanese leaders believe they must expand or face strangulation. Most critically, it had trapped Japan in a strategic position where all options seemed to lead to disaster, making the desperate gamble of attacking the United States seem like the least bad choice. The Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1941 revealed fundamental flaws in Japanese imperial strategy. Japan had the military power to conquer Chinese territory, but not the resources to pacify it, or the political wisdom to create a sustainable occupation. Japanese brutality, epitomized by the Nanjing Massacre, but repeated in countless smaller atrocities, united Chinese nationalism against Japan and eliminated any possibility of Chinese acceptance of Japanese rule. The war's costs far exceeded its benefits, bleeding Japan's economy and military while producing no resolution. The very success of Japanese armies in capturing Chinese cities created the conditions for ultimate Japanese defeat, as overextension, resource exhaustion, and international isolation made confrontation with more powerful enemies inevitable. The 4 years from 1937 to 1941 transformed the China incident from what Japanese leaders imagined would be a limited war to discipline a recalcitrant neighbor into an unwinnable quagmire that consumed Japanese resources and created enemies faster than Japanese armies could defeat them. The war that was supposed to secure Japan's position in Asia instead undermined it, demonstrating that military power alone could not create an empire when the occupied population refused to submit and international powers opposed expansion. By December 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, Japan was already locked in a war it could not win in China. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not start Japan's war of imperial expansion. It merely expanded an existing war that was already destroying Japan's economy and international position. The disaster that would consume the Japanese empire began not at Pearl Harbor, but at the Marco Polo Bridge. When Japanese officers manufactured a crisis to justify expansion they believed essential, but which would prove catastrophic. The decision for war came in early November 1941 during a series of imperial conferences where Japan's military and civilian leaders debated the nation's future. Prime Minister Tojo Hideki, a general who had risen through the ranks to political power, presented the stark choice facing Japan. The American oil embargo, imposed in July after Japan occupied southern Indochina, was strangling the Japanese economy. Oil reserves would last perhaps 18 months under current consumption, less if military operations intensified. Japan could either capitulate to American demands to withdraw from China and Indochina, abandoning everything gained through years of war and sacrifice, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force, which meant war with not just the Netherlands but Britain and the United States. There was no third option. On November 5th, Emperor Hirohito approved the decision for war, setting early December as the deadline for diplomacy to succeed. When negotiations in Washington failed to produce American acceptance of Japanese conquests in China, the final order was given. Japan would strike. Admiral Yamamoto Izoroku, commander of the Combined Fleet, had devised the plan to cripple American naval power at the outset of war. Yamamoto understood better than most Japanese leaders the immense industrial capacity of the United States. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington, witnessing American power firsthand. He harbored no illusions about Japan's chances in a prolonged war. When asked about prospects for victory, he reportedly said Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. But after that he had no confidence. The only hope was to strike so devastatingly that America would negotiate peace rather than fight a long war to reclaim lost possessions. The strike would come at Pearl Harbor, where the U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored in what Americans believed was safety, thousands of miles from Japan. The attack force assembled in secrecy at Hitakapu Bay in the remote Kuril Islands in late November. Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi commanded 6 aircraft carriers, the cream of Japanese naval aviation, accompanied by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and support vessels. The carriers embarked over 400 aircraft, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. Japanese pilots had trained for months in shallow water torpedo attacks and high-altitude bombing. They studied intelligence reports and aerial photographs showing the layout of Pearl Harbor, the locations of ships, and the positions of American airfields. Everything depended on achieving complete surprise. If detected, the attack force would be vulnerable to American airstrikes while still hundreds of miles from Hawaii. The fleet departed on November 26th, taking a northern route across the Pacific that avoided shipping lanes. For 12 days, the ships maintained radio silence while racing across rough northern seas. Tankers refueled the fleet at sea, a difficult operation in heavy weather, but essential to reach Hawaii and return. Lookouts watched constantly for American patrol planes or ships that might spot the force. None appeared. American intelligence had lost track of the Japanese carriers, but commanders in Hawaii believed they were in Japanese home waters. On the morning of December 6th, the attack force reached its launch point 200 miles north of Oahu. Final preparations began. Pilots wrote farewell letters, attended Shinto ceremonies, and received final briefings. Many wore hachimaki headbands inscribed with patriotic slogans. They expected casualties to be heavy, but were ready to die for the emperor. At 7:48 a.m., local time on December 7th, 1941, the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor and nearby airfields. The timing was deliberate, chosen for a Sunday morning when many American servicemen would be ashore or sleeping in after Saturday Night Liberty. The attack achieved complete surprise, with Japanese fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes descending on the harbor and military installations simultaneously. American radar had detected the incoming aircraft an hour earlier, but the duty officer mistakenly believed they were American B-17 bombers expected from the mainland. No alarm was raised. The torpedo planes attacked first, flying just 50 feet above the water to launch specially modified torpedoes fitted with wooden fins to run in Pearl Harbor's shallow 40-foot depth. USS Arizona exploded after a bomb penetrated its armor and detonated the forward ammunition magazine, sinking the ship and killing 1,177 crew members. USS Oklahoma capsized after multiple torpedo hits, trapping over 400 men inside the overturned hull. Some would be cut free from the hull days later, but most drowned in the darkness. The battleship California settled slowly to the harbor bottom as water flooded through torpedo damage. Nevada, despite heavy damage, attempted to get underway and escape the harbor, but a second wave of attacks forced her to beach herself to avoid sinking in the channel and blocking the harbor entrance. While naval aircraft struck the fleet, other Japanese planes attacked the airfields at Wheeler, Hickam, and Bellows. American planes were parked in tight rows, wingtip to wingtip, to guard against sabotage. This made perfect targets for strafing and bombing. The attacks destroyed 188 American aircraft, most on the ground before they could take off. Some American pilots managed to get airborne and fought back desperately, shooting down several Japanese planes, but they were overwhelmingly outnumbered. The second wave of 170 aircraft arrived an hour later, concentrating on ships that survived the first attack and on base facilities. By the time the attack ended shortly before 10 in the morning, less than 2 hours after it began, 2,403 Americans had been killed and 1,178 wounded. Yet the attack, devastating as it was, had failed in crucial respects. All 3 Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers were at sea and escaped damage. USS Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island, USS Lexington was delivering planes to Midway, and USS Saratoga was undergoing maintenance on the West Coast. These carriers would prove far more valuable than battleships in the coming war. Moreover, the Japanese failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, repair facilities, and submarine base, all of which would prove vital in the months ahead. Most of the damaged battleships were in shallow water and could be salvaged. Within months, all but 3 would be raised, repaired, and returned to service. Most critically, the attack united American public opinion for war in a way no other event could have achieved. Before Pearl Harbor, America was deeply divided over involvement in foreign wars. Isolationist sentiment ran strong, with many Americans believing Europe's conflicts were not America's concern. The attack transformed that sentiment overnight. The surprise assault on a Sunday morning, the deaths of thousands of servicemen, many killed while they slept, enraged Americans. On December 8th, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th and requesting a declaration of war. Congress approved with only 1 dissenting vote. Germany and Italy, honoring their tripartite pact obligations, declared war on the United States on December 11th. America entered World War II fully committed to unconditional victory. But Pearl Harbor was only one element of a massive coordinated offensive. Within 40 minutes of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese forces invaded Malaya, and over the next 24 hours struck Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, Singapore, and Midway. This simultaneous offensive across thousands of miles of ocean demonstrated Japanese military sophistication and the extensive planning that had preceded the attacks. Japanese forces struck at dawn across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, catching defenders unprepared and off balance. In the Philippines, Japanese aircraft destroyed much of the American Air Force on the ground at Clark Field and other bases, despite hours of warning following the Pearl Harbor attack. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding American and Filipino forces, had inexplicably failed to disperse or launch his aircraft before the Japanese struck. With American air power crippled, Japanese forces landed on northern Luzon on December 10th, followed by major landings at Lingayen Gulf on December 22nd. MacArthur's forces, numbering roughly 130,000 American and Filipino troops, fell back to defensive positions on the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor, where they would hold out for months but ultimately face defeat. The Japanese invasion of Malaya began on December 8th, when 27,000 Japanese troops under General Yamashita Tomoyuki landed at Cotabaru and advanced rapidly down the peninsula. British, Indian, and Australian forces defending Malaya were spread thin along hundreds of miles of coastline and jungle. They had expected Japanese attacks, but not the speed and ferocity of the invasion. Japanese forces used bicycles to move rapidly along roads through the jungle, carrying supplies and equipment that would otherwise require trucks. British forces fought delaying actions but were repeatedly outflanked and forced to retreat. The jungle terrain that British planners believed would slow Japanese advances instead concealed rapid movements that repeatedly surprised defenders. On December 10th, Japanese aircraft achieved one of the most significant naval victories of the early war when they sank the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse off the coast of Malaya. These were Britain's most modern and powerful warships in Asian waters, sent to deter Japanese aggression. Japanese bombers and torpedo planes from bases in Indochina attacked the ships while they operated without air cover, having lost contact with their fighter escort. Both ships were sunk within hours, with the loss of over 800 sailors. The sinking demonstrated that surface ships, no matter how powerful, could not survive without air cover. It also left Singapore, Britain's great naval base, without the fleet it was built to support. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day after 18 days of fighting. The colony's garrison of British, Canadian, and Indian troops, totaling about 14,000 men, faced overwhelming Japanese forces. The defenders knew relief was impossible and fought with desperate courage, but Japanese superiority in numbers, air power, and artillery made the outcome inevitable. The surrender marked the beginning of 3.5 years of brutal Japanese occupation. Japanese forces swept through the Pacific Islands with similar speed. Guam, an American possession with a small garrison, fell after 2 days. Wake Island, another American outpost, held out for 2 weeks before surrendering. The defenders, including Marines and civilian contractors, shot down numerous Japanese aircraft and repelled the first invasion attempt, sinking 2 Japanese destroyers. But without reinforcement, they could not hold indefinitely. When Wake fell on December 23rd, the entire outer ring of American Pacific defenses had collapsed. By January 1942, the scope of Japanese conquests was staggering. In less than 2 months, Japanese forces had captured or neutralized the Philippines, Guam, Wake, Hong Kong, most of Malaya, and numerous other positions. The offensive continued through the winter and spring. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress, fell on February 15th after a campaign that Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. General Arthur Percival surrendered over 130,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops to a Japanese force that numbered fewer than 60,000. The surrender shocked the world and shattered the myth of European military supremacy in Asia. The Japanese advance into Burma began in January 1942. Japanese forces entered from Thailand, rapidly pushing back British and Chinese defenders. The campaign aimed to cut the Burma Road, China's last supply route to the outside world, and to secure Burma's resources, particularly oil. British forces retreated toward India, suffering heavy casualties and leaving most of Burma under Japanese control by May 1942. The fall of Burma severed China's land connection to its allies, forcing supplies to be flown over the Himalayas, the dangerous hump route. The jewel of the southern offensive was the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia with its vast oil reserves. Japanese forces invaded from multiple directions in January and February 1942. Allied naval forces attempted to intercept the invasion's fleets but were defeated in a series of naval battles. The Battle of the Java Sea on February 27th saw a combined American, British, Dutch, and Australian fleet decisively beaten, with 5 cruisers and several destroyers sunk. The Japanese lost no ships. Dutch forces on Java surrendered on March 8th, ending organized resistance in the East Indies. Japan now controlled the oil fields that were the strategic objective of the entire southern campaign. By March 1942, the Japanese Empire had reached its greatest extent. Japanese forces controlled territory stretching from the borders of India to the mid-Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands to the northern coast of Australia. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as Japanese propaganda called it, encompassed roughly 3 million square miles of territory and over 450 million people. This vast empire included the resources Japan had sought: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Burma and Indochina, and minerals from throughout Southeast Asia. The conquests had been achieved with remarkable speed and at relatively low cost in Japanese casualties. Yet these conquests created problems as severe as those they solved. The empire was impossibly vast to garrison and defend. Japanese forces were spread across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle, connected by vulnerable shipping lanes. The conquered populations were hostile. Promises of Asian liberation from European colonialism rang hollow as Japanese rule proved brutal and exploitative. Japanese forces committed atrocities throughout the conquered territories. Massacres of Chinese civilians in Malaya and Singapore, particularly the Suk Ching operation that killed tens of thousands, created lasting hatred. Forced labor, harsh occupation policies, and economic exploitation turned local populations against their supposed liberators. The logistics of empire strained Japan's resources severely. The merchant marine that had to supply Japanese garrisons and extract resources from occupied territories was inadequate for the task and vulnerable to submarine attack. Japan began the war with roughly 6 million tons of merchant shipping. It would need to maintain at least 3 million tons to keep the economy functioning and supply the military. American submarines, operating from bases that survived Pearl Harbor, began sinking Japanese merchant ships from the war's earliest days. The submarine campaign would eventually strangle the Japanese economy, but even in early 1942, shipping losses were concerning. Moreover, the rapid conquests had not achieved their strategic objective. The United States had not sued for peace. American public opinion, far from being demoralized by defeats, had hardened in determination to achieve victory. American industry was mobilizing for war production on a scale Japan could not match. Every month of war saw more American ships, planes, and weapons produced. The 6-month window Yamamoto had predicted for Japanese success was ticking away, and America showed no signs of accepting Japanese conquests as permanent. The empire's defensive perimeter was dangerously extended. Japanese strategists had hoped to establish a defensive zone stretching from the Aleutians through Midway, Wake, the Marshall Islands, the Gilberts, the Solomons, New Guinea, Java, Sumatra, Malaya, and Burma. This perimeter would be too vast for America to assault, or so Japanese planners believed, but the perimeter was equally vast for Japan to defend. American carriers, operating from mobile task forces, could strike at any point, forcing Japan to disperse its forces or risk local defeats. The strategic initiative, which Japan had seized through surprise at Pearl Harbor, was beginning to slip away. The first signs came in April 1942 with the Doolittle Raid. 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier USS Hornet struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The raid caused minimal physical damage, but psychological impact was enormous. Japanese leaders had promised the home islands would never be attacked. The raid proved that promise false and forced the reallocation of fighters and resources to home defense. More importantly, it spurred Japanese military leaders to eliminate the threat of American carrier attacks by seizing additional territory. The Japanese Naval Command decided to extend the perimeter further by capturing Port Moresby in New Guinea, which would threaten Australia, and Midway Island, which would eliminate the American carrier threat in the Central Pacific. These operations, conducted in May and June 1942, would mark the limit of Japanese expansion. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May, fought entirely by carrier aircraft, with surface ships never sighting each other, stopped the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby. Both sides suffered losses, with the Americans losing carrier Lexington and the Japanese losing light carrier Shoho, and suffering damage to carrier Shokaku. Tactically, Japan won more, sinking a fleet carrier for a light carrier. Strategically, the Americans won by stopping Japanese expansion toward Australia. The decisive battle came at Midway in early June 1942. Yamamoto assembled the most powerful fleet Japan had ever sent to sea, including 4 fleet carriers and numerous battleships and cruisers. He planned to lure the American carriers into a trap and destroy them, eliminating the last obstacle to Japanese control of the Pacific. But American intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes and knew the attack was coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding American forces in the Pacific, positioned his 3 available carriers northeast of Midway to ambush the Japanese force. The battle on June 4th became one of the most important naval engagements in history. American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers with their decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. Within 5 minutes, carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were mortally wounded, their flight decks torn apart by bombs and raging fires consuming their hangars. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that crippled carrier USS Yorktown, but was itself destroyed later that day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, roughly 250 aircraft, and many of its most experienced pilots. American losses were 1 carrier and about 150 aircraft. The balance of naval power in the Pacific shifted decisively in America's favor. Midway marked the end of Japanese expansion and the beginning of American counteroffensive. Japan would continue to fight tenaciously for 3 more years, but it would fight defensively, trying to hold what it had taken rather than advancing further. The 6 months Yamamoto had predicted Japan could run wild had expired. American industrial power was beginning to manifest in numbers of ships and aircraft Japan could not match. The vast Pacific Empire, conquered so rapidly and at such low cost, would now have to be defended against enemies with superior resources, secure supply lines, and growing experience. The period from December 1941 to June 1942 represented the high tide of the Japanese Empire. In 6 months, Japan had seized the largest empire in Asian history, defeated European colonial powers repeatedly, and established itself as the dominant military force in East Asia and the Pacific. But the empire was built on foundations that could not support it. Japan lacked the merchant shipping to supply and exploit its conquests. It lacked the industrial capacity to replace losses in ships and aircraft at the rate America could produce them. Most critically, it had united its enemies in determination to fight until Japan was utterly defeated. The conquests that were supposed to make Japan secure had instead guaranteed a long war Japan could not win. The empire's expansion phase was over. Its destruction was about to begin. The defeat at Midway had shocked Japanese military leaders, but many still believed the war could be won, or at least fought to an acceptable stalemate. The vast territories conquered in early 1942 remained under Japanese control. The resource-rich Dutch East Indies pumped oil to fuel Japanese ships and aircraft. Defensive positions stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. If Japan could hold these positions and inflict such heavy casualties that America tired of the war, perhaps a negotiated peace remained possible. This delusion would die slowly, island by bloody island, as American forces began their long advance across the Pacific. The campaign that began at Guadalcanal in August 1942 would grind on for 3 years, consuming the Japanese Empire piece by piece until nothing remained but the smoldering ruins of the home islands themselves. American forces landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, less than 2 months after Midway. The objective was an airfield the Japanese were constructing on this obscure island in the Solomon Chain. Control of the airfield would allow American aircraft to threaten Japanese supply lines to Australia and provide a base for further advances. The initial landing encountered little resistance. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal numbered only about 2,000, mostly construction workers and their guards. By evening on August 7th, Marines had secured the airfield, which they renamed Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. The easy landing proved deceptive. What followed was 6 months of brutal fighting that would become one of the war's turning points. The Japanese response came swiftly and decisively at sea. On the night of August 8th to 9th, a Japanese cruiser force commanded by Admiral Mikawa Gunichi surprised American and Australian ships protecting the landing beaches. In the Battle of Savo Island, Japanese ships sank 4 Allied cruisers in less than an hour of savage night combat, killing over 1,000 sailors. It was one of the worst American naval defeats of the war. The victory demonstrated Japanese superiority in night combat, where their superior optics, training, and the deadly long-lance torpedoes gave them devastating advantages. But Mikawa failed to attack the vulnerable American transports, a decision he would regret. The Marines on Guadalcanal remained supplied and reinforced, though precariously. The battle for Guadalcanal developed into a grinding attrition campaign unlike anything either side had anticipated. By day, American aircraft operating from Henderson Field controlled the skies, attacking Japanese ships and bombing Japanese positions. By night, Japanese warships dominated, shelling Henderson Field and landing reinforcements in operations the Americans called the Tokyo Express and the Japanese called Rat Runs. Both sides poured troops onto the island. Conditions were nightmarish. Guadalcanal was covered in dense jungle, crawling with malaria-carrying mosquitoes, infested with tropical diseases, and drenched by torrential rains that turned trails into rivers of mud. Troops on both sides suffered as much from disease as from enemy action. Food became scarce. Japanese soldiers, cut off from adequate supplies, began to starve. The Japanese mounted several major offensives to retake Henderson Field. In late August, 900 Japanese troops launched a night attack across the Tenarue River, confident they could overwhelm the Marine defenses. American machine guns and artillery cut them down in waves. When dawn came, Japanese bodies carpeted the riverbank. Only a handful survived to retreat into the jungle. In mid-September, a larger force of about 6,000 Japanese attacked from the south. After several days of desperate fighting, American forces held. The Japanese suffered over 1,200 casualties and retreated. In late October, the Japanese launched their largest offensive, committing over 20,000 troops in coordinated attacks from multiple directions. For 3 nights, Japanese soldiers hurled themselves at American positions in human wave attacks that Marine defenders mowed down with machine guns and artillery. When the offensive collapsed, over 500 Japanese were dead for minimal American casualties. These ground battles occurred simultaneously with major naval engagements as both sides struggled for control of the sea around Guadalcanal. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August saw carriers clash again, with both sides suffering damage but no decisive result. The Battle of Cape Esperance in October gave the Americans a rare surface victory in night combat. Then came the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November, a confused series of engagements spread over 3 days that saw some of the most violent surface combat of the war. American and Japanese battleships slugged it out at point-blank range, trading salvos in darkness. The battleship USS South Dakota was battered nearly to destruction. The battleship Washington saved her, closing to within 5,000 yards of the Japanese battleship Kirishima and pounding her into a burning wreck with radar-directed gunfire. The naval battle of Guadalcanal proved decisive. Japanese forces lost 2 battleships, a cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 11 transports carrying 7,000 troops and critical supplies. American losses were severe, including 2 cruisers and 7 destroyers, but they had stopped the Japanese reinforcement effort. After mid-November, the Japanese could no longer supply their forces on Guadalcanal adequately. Japanese soldiers on the island began to starve in earnest. Disease ravaged them. Some resorted to eating roots, grass, and the flesh of dead comrades. Of the 36,000 Japanese troops sent to Guadalcanal, about 20,000 would die, most from starvation and disease rather than combat. In late December 1942, Emperor Hirohito reluctantly authorized evacuation of Guadalcanal. In early February 1943, Japanese destroyers conducted a masterful withdrawal operation, evacuating about 11,000 surviving troops. When American forces swept the island, they found abandoned positions, emaciated corpses, and evidence of the horror Japanese troops had endured. The campaign had cost the Americans about 7,000 casualties, including 1,600 killed. The Japanese lost 24,000 dead and hundreds of aircraft they could not replace. More importantly, they had lost the strategic initiative. Never again would Japan conduct major offensive operations. From Guadalcanal forward, Japan would fight defensively, trying to hold what it had taken while American power grew inexorably. The victory at Guadalcanal allowed American forces to advance up the Solomon chain toward Rabaul, the major Japanese base on New Britain. General Douglas MacArthur's forces simultaneously pushed along the northern coast of New Guinea. But rather than assault heavily defended Rabaul directly, American strategists developed a new approach, island hopping, also called leapfrogging. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Instead of capturing every Japanese-held island in sequence, American forces would bypass heavily defended positions, leaving Japanese garrisons isolated and impotent while American forces advanced toward objectives of genuine strategic value. Islands like Rabaul, with their tens of thousands of Japanese troops, would be left to wither on the vine, cut off from supplies and unable to influence the war's outcome. The strategy required air and naval superiority to work. Aircraft carriers, operating in mobile task forces, provided air cover and striking power. New classes of aircraft carriers, built in American shipyards in staggering numbers, joined the fleet monthly. By late 1943, American carrier forces were stronger than ever, despite losses at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. Fast battleships, designed to accompany carriers rather than fight traditional gun duels, provided anti-aircraft defense and shore bombardment. Most critically, a new generation of submarines was strangling Japanese shipping. American submarines, operating from bases that survived Pearl Harbor, hunted Japanese merchant ships and tankers with deadly efficiency. By 1943, Japanese merchant losses exceeded new construction by wide margins. In November 1943, American forces invaded Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, beginning the Central Pacific Drive. The assault on Tarawa's primary island, Batio, revealed both the effectiveness and the costs of amphibious warfare against determined defenders. Japanese forces had fortified Baitio with concrete bunkers, coastal guns, and interlocking fields of fire. Over 4,800 Japanese troops garrisoned an island barely 2 miles long. American planners believed naval and air bombardment would destroy these defenses. They were wrong. When Marines waded ashore on November 20th, 1943, they walked into a storm of fire. Many landing craft grounded on reefs hundreds of yards from shore. Marines had to wade through chest-deep water while Japanese machine guns cut them down. Bodies floated in the lagoon. The beach became a killing ground. It took 3 days of savage fighting to secure Baitio. Marines attacked concrete bunkers with flamethrowers and demolition charges. They cleared fortified positions yard by yard. Japanese defenders fought nearly to the last man, with only 17 of the 4,800-man garrison captured alive. American casualties exceeded 3,000, including over 1,000 killed. Photos of dead Marines floating in the surf shocked Americans at home. But Tarawa, despite its horrific cost, taught valuable lessons about amphibious assault that would save lives in future operations. Better pre-invasion reconnaissance, more effective naval bombardment, and improved coordination between ground and air forces would characterize subsequent landings. The Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944 demonstrated how quickly American forces adapted. Kwajalein Atoll was assaulted in late January after the most intensive naval bombardment yet delivered in the Pacific. The bombardment was so effective that when Marines and Army troops landed on February 1st, they advanced rapidly against shattered Japanese defenses. Kwajalein fell in 4 days, with far fewer casualties than Tarawa. The same pattern repeated at Eniwetok in mid-February. American forces were learning how to conduct amphibious operations with devastating efficiency. By mid-1944, American advances in both the Southwest and Central Pacific had brought Japanese positions within bombing range of the home islands. The Mariana Islands, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, lay only about 1,500 miles from Tokyo. Capturing these islands would provide bases for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers, capable of striking Japan itself. In June 1944, American forces invaded Saipan. The Japanese understood the stakes. Loss of Saipan would bring Japanese cities within range of American bombers. The Japanese Navy sorties from its bases in the Philippines to challenge the American invasion force. The resulting Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th to 20th, 1944, became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 600 Japanese aircraft attacked the American carrier task force. American fighters, guided by radar and flying superior aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat, massacred the Japanese formations. In 2 days, the Japanese lost over 400 aircraft and 3 aircraft carriers to sinking. American losses totaled about 130 planes, mostly operational losses rather than combat casualties. The battle destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force. Japan still had carriers, but lacked trained pilots to fly from them. The pilots who died over the Philippine Sea represented years of training that could not be replaced. On Saipan itself, American forces faced a Japanese garrison of 32,000 troops determined to fight to the death. The battle lasted 25 days and cost over 16,000 American casualties, including 3,400 killed. But Japanese losses were catastrophic. Nearly the entire garrison died, along with thousands of Japanese civilians. The final days saw horrific scenes as Japanese soldiers and civilians committed suicide rather than surrender. At Marpi Point, hundreds of civilians jumped from cliffs onto rocks below. Japanese soldiers detonated grenades, killing themselves and their families. Some were driven to suicide by propaganda, claiming Americans would torture and murder them. Others chose death over the dishonor of surrender. The fall of Saipan so shocked Japanese leaders that Prime Minister Tojo Hideki resigned. The first-time military defeat forced a change in government. The capture of Tinian and Guam followed in July and August 1944. By late summer, American engineers were constructing massive air bases on these islands. Runways capable of handling B-29s stretched for miles. Support facilities, fuel storage, and bomb dumps sprawled across the islands. From these bases, beginning in November 1944, Hundreds of B-29s would strike Japanese cities with increasing frequency and devastating effect. The strategic bombing campaign that would ultimately kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians and destroy much of urban Japan began from airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. While the Central Pacific Drive advanced, MacArthur's forces continued up the New Guinea coast toward the Philippines. MacArthur had promised to return when he evacuated the Philippines in 1942. He made that promise a personal crusade. By mid-1944, his forces had advanced to western New Guinea, bypassing tens of thousands of Japanese troops isolated at Rabaul and other strongpoints. The New Guinea campaign had been brutal, fought in some of the world's most hostile terrain. Dense jungles, towering mountains, disease-ridden swamps, and determined Japanese resistance made every mile a struggle. But American forces had prevailed, demonstrating that Japan's defensive perimeter could be rolled back methodically. The question of where to strike next divided American military leadership. Admiral Nimitz favored bypassing the Philippines entirely and invading Taiwan, which would cut Japanese supply lines more effectively. MacArthur insisted on liberating the Philippines, arguing it was strategically necessary and morally imperative given American promises to the Filipino people. President Roosevelt sided with MacArthur. American forces would return to the Philippines in the fall of 1944. The two-year period from August 1942 to August 1944 had fundamentally transformed the Pacific War. Japan had been forced onto the defensive after Midway and had never regained the initiative. The brutal campaign at Guadalcanal had demonstrated that American forces could defeat Japanese troops in jungle warfare and endure the grinding attrition of island combat. The island-hopping strategy had allowed American forces to advance rapidly while isolating and neutralizing major Japanese strongpoints. American industrial production had created a fleet and air force that dwarfed anything Japan could field. Submarines had begun the destruction of Japan's merchant marine, cutting the flow of oil, food, and raw materials from conquered territories to the home islands. Japanese forces continued to fight with fanatical determination, inflicting heavy casualties and showing no willingness to surrender. But determination alone could not overcome the vast disparity in resources and industrial capacity. Every Japanese ship sunk, every aircraft shot down, every pilot killed was increasingly difficult to replace. America, by contrast, was producing ships, planes, and trained crews at rates that seemed almost miraculous. New Essex-class aircraft carriers joined the fleet every few months. New aircraft models like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair outperformed anything Japan had. American submarines grew more numerous and deadly. American logistics, initially inadequate at Guadalcanal, had evolved into a sophisticated system capable of supplying massive forces across vast distances. The Japanese home islands remained untouched by direct attack through 1943, but that immunity ended with the Mariana Islands capture. The first B-29 raid struck Tokyo on November 24, 1944. The bombers carried only conventional explosives and caused modest damage, but they announced that Japanese cities would now experience the war directly. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese civilians who had celebrated victory after victory in 1941 and 1942 now understood that defeat was approaching. The government's propaganda grew more shrill, calling for sacrifice and preparation for the final decisive battle. But informed observers recognized the truth. Japan had lost the war. The only questions remaining were how long the war would continue and what price would be paid before Japan surrendered. The period from mid-1942 to mid-1944 also saw the emergence of Japanese suicide tactics that would characterize the war's final year. Early in the war, Japanese pilots occasionally crashed their damaged planes into American ships, but these were individual decisions made in extremis rather than organized tactics. By late 1944, as trained Japanese pilots became scarce and American defenses more formidable, Japanese commanders began organizing kamikaze units whose mission was to crash explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. The tactic was born of desperation, but proved terrifyingly effective. A single kamikaze that penetrated American defenses could cripple or sink a ship. The psychological impact on American sailors who watched aircraft deliberately crash into their ships was severe. On the ground, Japanese defenders increasingly fought to the death rather than surrendering. Banzai charges, where Japanese soldiers attacked in waves despite hopeless odds, became common. Officers told their troops that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. Some believed propaganda that Americans would torture and kill prisoners. Others embraced the samurai ideal of dying in battle rather than living in defeat. Whatever their motivations, Japanese soldiers and Marines rarely surrendered. On island after island, American forces killed nearly the entire garrison, while taking only dozens or hundreds of prisoners. This refusal to surrender forced American commanders to employ increasingly destructive tactics, using flamethrowers, demolitions, and heavy weapons to eliminate enemy positions, regardless of whether occupants wished to surrender. By September 1944, as American forces prepared to invade the Philippines, the strategic situation was clear. Japan had been pushed back thousands of miles from its 1942 perimeter. Its navy had been crippled, its air forces devastated, and its merchant marine was dying under submarine attack. American forces controlled bases from which they could strike the Japanese home islands directly. Yet, despite these catastrophic losses, Japan showed no signs of surrendering. The government continued to speak of victory through determination and sacrifice. The military prepared defenses throughout the Philippines, Taiwan, and the home islands. Civilians were organized into militia units and trained with bamboo spears. The Japanese people were being psychologically prepared for a final apocalyptic battle. The island campaigns from Guadalcanal through the Marianas had demonstrated that Japan would not surrender merely because the war was lost. American commanders understood that the final campaigns, approaching the Japanese home islands, would be bloodier than anything yet seen. The turning tide had become a tsunami, but the tsunami would have to crash over every defended position before Japan would submit. The worst was still to come. The year 1945 opened with Japan facing certain defeat, but unwilling to accept it. The empire that had stretched from Burma to the mid-Pacific just 3 years earlier was shrinking daily under relentless American pressure. Yet Japanese leaders continued to speak of victory through determination, of fighting until the last Japanese died, defending the sacred soil of the home islands. This refusal to acknowledge reality would cost hundreds of thousands more lives before Emperor Hirohito's voice, broadcast by radio for the first time in Japanese history, would finally announce surrender in August. The 8 months from January to September 1945 witnessed suffering on a scale that defied comprehension, culminating in 2 atomic explosions that changed warfare forever and brought the empire that began with Perry's black ships full circle to unconditional submission. The Philippines campaign consumed the first months of 1945, demonstrating both American military supremacy and the horrific costs of Japanese refusal to surrender. General MacArthur had returned to the Philippines in October 1944, landing at Leyte and declaring the liberation of the islands. But Japanese forces refused to accept defeat. On Leyte alone, over 56,000 Japanese soldiers died, fighting to the death in dense jungles and mountainous terrain. American casualties exceeded 15,000. The pattern repeated across the archipelago. In January, American forces landed on Luzon, the main island where Manila, the capital, was located. Japanese troops under General Yamashita Tomoyuki had retreated into the mountains. But naval forces and their commander, Admiral Iwabuchi Sanji, chose to defend Manila. The battle for Manila became one of the war's most destructive urban conflicts. Japanese forces, trapped in the city with no hope of escape or reinforcement, fought building by building. They committed atrocities against Filipino civilians on a massive scale, raping thousands of women, murdering entire families, and massacring patients in hospitals. When American forces fought their way into the city in February, they found streets littered with corpses, buildings destroyed, and a population traumatized by Japanese brutality. The battle lasted until early March. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians died, most killed by Japanese forces or caught in the crossfire. American casualties exceeded 6,500, while the entire Japanese garrison of 16,000 men was wiped out. Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, lay in ruins, the most destroyed Allied capital except Warsaw. While fighting raged in the Philippines, American forces prepared for assaults on islands ever closer to Japan. Iwo Jima, a volcanic island halfway between the Marianas, and Tokyo became the next target. This 8-square-mile island seemed insignificant, but its airfields could support fighter escorts for B-29 bombers striking Japan and provide emergency landing sites for damaged bombers. More fundamentally, capturing Iwo Jima would demonstrate to Japan that no defensive position, however fortified, could withstand American power. General Kuribayashi Tadamichi commanded Iwo Jima's defense with 21,000 troops. Kuribayashi was perhaps the most capable defensive commander Japan produced during the war. He had studied in the United States and understood American military power. He knew Iwo Jima could not be held indefinitely, but believed he could make its capture so costly that American public opinion might pressure the government to negotiate rather than invade Japan itself. He spent months transforming the island into an intricate fortress, with 11 miles of tunnels connecting hundreds of fortified positions. He prohibited the banzai charges that had wasted Japanese lives in previous battles, instead ordering his troops to fight from prepared positions, inflicting maximum casualties while preserving Japanese strength as long as possible. American forces landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. Marines struggled ashore on beaches of volcanic ash that made footing treacherous and vehicle movement nearly impossible. For the first hour, Japanese defenders held fire, allowing more Americans to come ashore before unleashing devastating artillery and machine gun fire from hidden positions. The Americans had expected to secure the island in days. Instead, the battle lasted 5 weeks and became one of the bloodiest in Marine Corps history. Every yard of ground had to be fought for, every bunker and cave system cleared with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and grenades. Japanese defenders fought from positions that survived naval bombardment intact, emerging from tunnels to attack from unexpected directions, then disappearing underground before American forces could retaliate. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi on February 23rd became the war's most famous image, symbolizing American determination. But the photograph was taken just 4 days into a battle that would continue for 3 more weeks of brutal combat. When the island was finally declared secured on March 26th, over 6,800 Marines had been killed and nearly 20,000 wounded. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated, with only about 200 prisoners taken from an original force of 21,000. Kuribayashi himself died in the final days, his body never found. The battle achieved its objectives, with B-29s using Iwo Jima's airfields for the rest of the war. But the casualty rates shocked Americans and intensified debate about the costs of invading Japan itself. If Iwo Jima was horrific, Okinawa was worse. This large island, just 350 miles from Japan's southernmost main island of Kyushu, was Japanese territory, home to nearly 300,000 civilians. Its capture would provide bases for the invasion of Japan and cut the home islands off from remaining territories to the south. The invasion, codenamed Operation Iceberg, began on April 1, 1945. Over 180,000 American troops landed on Okinawa's western beaches in the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The initial landing was unopposed, leading to momentary hope that Japanese resistance might be minimal. That hope died quickly. Lieutenant General Ushijima Mitsuru commanded over 100,000 Japanese troops on Okinawa. Like Kuribayashi, he adopted a strategy of attrition, constructing elaborate defenses in Okinawa's southern hills and waiting for American forces to attack prepared positions. When Americans advanced south, they encountered a network of fortified ridges, caves, and tunnels that made every position a fortress. The terrain was nightmarish for attackers, with steep ridges honeycombed with caves that Japanese defenders used as firing positions and shelters from artillery. Heavy spring rains turned the battlefield into a muddy quagmire. Battles for individual positions lasted days or weeks. The Meat Grinder, Sugarloaf Hill, and Shuri Castle became names synonymous with slaughter. The battle lasted 82 days, finally ending on June 22nd. American casualties exceeded 49,000, including over 12,000 dead. The Japanese garrison was annihilated, with over 100,000 soldiers killed. Most tragically, Okinawan civilians suffered catastrophically. Between 40,000 and 150,000 civilians died, caught between the armies or killed by Japanese forces, who sometimes murdered civilians attempting to surrender to Americans. Japanese troops forced civilians to commit suicide rather than face capture, telling them Americans would torture and rape them. Mass suicides occurred at cliffs and in caves, where entire families died together. The destruction of civilian life on Okinawa horrified American commanders and gave them nightmarish visions of what an invasion of the main Japanese islands might entail. The naval battle around Okinawa proved equally devastating. Japanese forces launched massive kamikaze attacks against the American fleet supporting the invasion. Beginning on April 6th and continuing into June, waves of suicide aircraft struck American ships. Over 1,900 kamikaze aircraft attacked, sinking 36 ships and damaging 368 more. Over 4,900 American sailors were killed, more than in any previous naval campaign. Ships' crews watched in horror as aircraft deliberately crashed into their vessels. The psychological strain was immense, with some sailors breaking under the constant threat of suicide attack. The kamikaze campaign demonstrated Japanese desperation, but also their determination to fight, regardless of cost. The final major Japanese naval operation occurred during the Okinawa campaign. On April 6th, the battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, sortied from Japan with a light cruiser and 8 destroyers in Operation Tengo. The fleet had fuel for only a one-way trip. The mission was suicidal from the outset: sail to Okinawa, beach the ships, and use them as stationary artillery platforms until destroyed. The operation reflected the desperation and irrationality that had seized Japanese military planning. American submarines detected the fleet shortly after departure. On April 7th, American carrier aircraft attacked in waves. With no air cover and inadequate anti-aircraft defenses, the Japanese ships were doomed. Yamato absorbed multiple torpedo and bomb hits before exploding and sinking. The light cruiser and 4 destroyers were also sunk. Over 3,700 Japanese sailors died. The Americans lost 10 aircraft and 12 aircrew. It was the Imperial Japanese Navy's final sortie, a meaningless sacrifice that accomplished nothing except adding thousands more names to the casualty lists. While battles raged on land and sea, American bombers were destroying Japan's cities systematically. The strategic bombing campaign had begun in late 1944 from bases in the Marianas. Initially, B-29s conducted high-altitude precision bombing of industrial targets. Results were disappointing, with weather, technical problems, and navigational difficulties limiting effectiveness. In March 1945, General Curtis LeMay changed tactics, ordering low-altitude incendiary attacks on Japanese cities at night. The new approach targeted Japanese war production indirectly by destroying the cities where workers lived and the small factories and workshops scattered throughout urban areas. The night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, saw the deadliest air raid in history. Over 300 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo, creating a firestorm that consumed 16 square miles of the city. Temperatures in the firestorm exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. People suffocated as the fire consumed oxygen. Others burned to death or died when buildings collapsed. Water in canals boiled. Over 100,000 people died in a single night, more than would die at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Another million were left homeless. The bombing of Tokyo marked the beginning of a systematic campaign that would destroy every major Japanese city. By August, over 60 cities had been firebombed. Urban Japan was being reduced to ash and rubble. Japanese civilians endured these attacks with remarkable stoicism, but the bombing devastated industrial production and morale. Factories were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt or dispersed. Workers could not reach surviving factories through destroyed transportation networks. Food shortages intensified as bombing disrupted distribution and sank the ships carrying rice from occupied territories. By summer 1945, many Japanese were malnourished and some faced starvation. The government organized civilians into militia units, issuing bamboo spears and telling them to prepare for the final battle when Americans invaded. Children practiced attacking mock tanks with explosives. Women trained to fight with sharpened bamboo poles. The entire nation was being mobilized for a suicidal last stand. Japan's strategic situation by mid-1945 was hopeless. The submarine blockade had strangled Japanese shipping. Oil imports had ceased. Industrial production was collapsing. The army in China, still over 1 million strong, could not be supplied or reinforced. Territories in Southeast Asia were isolated. American forces controlled Okinawa and prepared to invade Kyushu. The Soviet Union, with whom Japan had maintained a neutrality pact, showed signs of abandoning that agreement. Diplomatic feelers through neutral countries brought no positive responses from the Allies, who demanded unconditional surrender. Yet, Japanese military leaders continued to speak of inflicting such casualties in the homeland defense that America would negotiate a conditional peace, preserving the emperor and avoiding occupation. This delusion rested on fundamental misunderstandings of American politics and will. Japanese leaders believed Americans, having achieved victory in Europe, lacked the resolve to sustain the casualties necessary to invade Japan. They assumed that defending the home islands with the entire population mobilized would create a bloodbath that would force negotiations. They calculated that if they could inflict casualties matching or exceeding Okinawa's proportions, American public opinion would demand a negotiated settlement. This strategy had one fatal flaw. Americans were prepared to use any weapon necessary to avoid the casualties a conventional invasion would entail. The Manhattan Project had consumed billions of dollars and employed thousands of scientists and workers across multiple secret facilities in the United States. The goal was simple: build an atomic bomb before Germany did. By the time the first bomb was tested successfully in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, Germany had already surrendered. But the war with Japan continued, and American military planners estimated that invading the home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese deaths. President Harry Truman, who had only learned of the Manhattan Project after becoming president upon Roosevelt's death in April, faced an awful decision. The weapon existed. It worked. Should it be used? The debate over whether to use the atomic bomb began before Hiroshima and continues today. Some scientists involved in the Manhattan Project argued for a demonstration explosion on an uninhabited island, hoping the display of power would convince Japan to surrender without killing civilians. Military planners rejected this idea, arguing that if the demonstration failed to convince Japan, or if the bomb failed to detonate, the psychological impact would strengthen Japanese resolve. They also noted that only 2 bombs would be ready by early August, with more following slowly. Every bomb had to count. Most crucially, after Okinawa's horrors, American military leaders had no interest in invading Japan if any alternative existed. The bomb represented that alternative. On July 26th, the United States, Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, calling for Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of Barch, quote, Cesar Dorist if Japan refused. Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro and the Supreme War Council debated the declaration. Some favored accepting it if the emperor's position could be guaranteed. Others insisted Japan should fight on. Rather than responding immediately, the government initially decided to ignore the declaration publicly while attempting to negotiate through the Soviet Union. This delay proved fatal. The Soviets, preparing to enter the war against Japan as promised at Yalta, had no interest in mediating peace. On August 6, 1945, the B-29. Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy on Hiroshima. The bomb detonated at 8:15 a.m. local time, approximately 1,800 feet above the city. The explosion released energy equivalent to about 15,000 tons of TNT. A blinding flash lit the sky, followed by a shockwave that demolished buildings for miles. A fireball engulfed the city center, vaporizing people near Ground Zero. Those farther away suffered burns from thermal radiation. The mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet. When the smoke cleared, Hiroshima had been destroyed. Approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people died immediately. Thousands more would die from radiation sickness and burns in the following days and weeks. President Truman's statement announcing the bombing called Hiroshima a military base. Though it was primarily a city of civilians and soldiers, he warned Japan to expect more atomic attacks if they did not surrender. Japanese leaders received initial reports of a massive explosion, but did not immediately understand what had happened. Communications from Hiroshima had been cut off. Investigators sent to the city found devastation beyond comprehension. Yet even this catastrophe did not produce consensus for surrender. The Supreme War Council remained divided, with military leaders arguing that Japan could still fight. On August 8th, 2 days after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. Soviet armies, including troops and equipment transferred from Europe after Germany's defeat, swept through Japanese positions. The Kwantung Army, once the elite of Japan's military, had been stripped of its best units to defend the Pacific Islands and home islands. What remained collapsed under the Soviet onslaught. Within days, Soviet forces had occupied Manchuria, Korea, and the Kuril Islands. The invasion destroyed any remaining hope that the Soviet Union might mediate a negotiated peace. Japan now faced enemies on all sides with no prospect of aid. On August 9th, before Japanese leaders could fully process the implications of the Soviet invasion, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The primary target had been Kokura, but cloud cover forced the bomber to divert to its secondary target. Fat Man, a plutonium bomb more powerful than Little Boy, detonated at 11:02 a.m. above Nagasaki's Urakami Valley. The hills surrounding the valley contained some of the blast, limiting the damage compared to Hiroshima. Nevertheless, approximately 35,000 to 40,000 people died immediately, with thousands more dying later. The city's industrial areas and port facilities were destroyed. The double shock of the Soviet invasion and the second atomic bomb finally broke the deadlock in Japan's leadership. The Supreme War Council met on the night of August 9th to decide Japan's fate. 3 members favored accepting the Potsdam Declaration if the emperor's position was preserved. 3 members insisted on additional conditions: no occupation of Japan, Japanese handling of war crimes trials, and voluntary disarmament. The council deadlocked. Prime Minister Suzuki took the unprecedented step of requesting the emperor intervene to break the tie. In the early hours of August 10th, in a bomb shelter beneath the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito spoke. He said continuing the war would result in the destruction of the Japanese nation and suffering for all humanity. He ordered acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, provided the emperor's sovereignty was maintained. The Japanese government transmitted its conditional acceptance to the Allies through neutral Switzerland. The response came quickly. Japan could surrender with the understanding that the emperor's authority would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. This ambiguous language left the emperor's ultimate fate unclear, but suggested he might remain as a figurehead under Allied control. The Supreme War Council deadlocked again. Some military leaders advocated continuing the war rather than accepting any occupation. They proposed one final decisive battle that would force better terms. But the reality was inescapable. 2 cities had been destroyed by single bombs. The Soviet invasion was crushing Japanese forces in Manchuria. American bombers ruled the skies. The nation was starving. There was nothing left to fight with. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito again intervened, this time definitively. He recorded a speech to be broadcast the next day announcing Japan's surrender. That night, a group of army officers attempted a coup, trying to seize the recording and prevent its broadcast. They attacked the imperial palace, killed several guards, and searched desperately for the recording. But senior military leaders refused to support the coup. The officers committed suicide when their plot failed. At noon on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast by radio to the Japanese people. Most had never heard his voice. Speaking in formal court language few ordinary Japanese understood completely, he announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. He cited the enemy's use of a new and cruel bomb that threatened the very survival of the Japanese nation and all human civilization. He called on his subjects to bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable. The reaction across Japan was mixed. Many wept, unable to accept that Japan had lost. Some committed suicide rather than face defeat. Military units in isolated locations refused to accept the surrender order and continued fighting for days or weeks until forced to lay down their arms. But most Japanese, exhausted by years of war and months of bombing, simply felt relief that the fighting was over. Allied forces, uncertain whether Japan would truly surrender or whether the emperor's broadcast was a trick, maintained combat readiness. Not until Japanese envoys arrived with surrender documents and American forces began landing in Japan did the reality sink in. The war was truly over. The formal surrender ceremony occurred on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided as Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu Mamoru signed for the Japanese government. General Umezu Yoshijiro signed for the Japanese military. Representatives of the Allied nations signed as witnesses. The ceremony lasted only 23 minutes. The empire that had begun with a Meiji Restoration 77 years earlier, that had defeated China and Russia, that had conquered vast territories across Asia and the Pacific, had ended. Japan had achieved unconditional surrender, the very outcome the Meiji leaders had sworn the nation would never endure. The human cost of 1945 defied calculation. American casualties from January through August exceeded 170,000, including over 30,000 dead. Japanese military deaths in the same period approached 500,000. Civilian deaths from bombing, starvation, and the atomic bombs probably exceeded 1 million. The atomic bombs alone killed between 150,000 and 250,000 people by the end of 1945. Hundreds of thousands more Japanese had died in Manchuria during the Soviet invasion. The Philippines, Okinawa, and Japanese cities were ruins. Millions had been left homeless. Industrial production had collapsed. The economy was shattered. 16 years of warfare, from the invasion of Manchuria to final surrender, had cost Japan everything it had gained and more. The question of whether the atomic bombs were necessary to end the war remains contentious. Critics argue that Japan was already defeated, that the Soviet invasion would have forced surrender without atomic weapons, and that the bombings were therefore unnecessary and morally indefensible attacks on civilians. Defenders respond that Japanese military leaders showed no signs of surrendering before Hiroshima, that casualty estimates for invading Japan ran into the hundreds of thousands for Americans alone and millions for Japanese, and that the bombs saved lives by ending the war quickly. Both perspectives contain truth. Japan was strategically defeated by August 1945, but its leaders showed no willingness to accept unconditional surrender before the atomic bombs and Soviet invasion combined to break their resolve. Whether alternative approaches might have achieved surrender without atomic weapons remains unknowable. What is certain is that the atomic bombs changed warfare and international relations forever. The destructive power demonstrated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki ensured that any future conflict between major powers armed with nuclear weapons would risk civilization itself. The Cold War that followed would be shaped by nuclear deterrence, the understanding that using such weapons would invite mutual annihilation. The bombs also shaped Japan's post-war identity, making the nation a powerful advocate for nuclear disarmament and a cautionary example of nuclear warfare's horrors. The Japanese Empire died in flames and radiation in August 1945. The empire that had been built through Meiji modernization, victory over China and Russia, and relentless expansion through Asia and the Pacific had lasted barely 4 decades in its full form. It had brought modernization and education to some regions while inflicting unimaginable suffering on others. It had defeated European colonialism in Asia, only to replace it with Japanese colonialism that proved equally brutal. It had begun with the promise of Asian liberation and ended with Asian populations celebrating its destruction. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, the ideological justification for Japanese imperialism, had been exposed as a mask for exploitation and atrocity. As Emperor Hirohito spoke on August 15th, urging his subjects to bear the unbearable, he marked not just the end of a war, but the end of an era. The emperor-centered state ideology that had justified expansion, the belief in Japanese racial superiority that had permitted atrocities, the military dominance over civilian government that had led to catastrophic decisions, all would be swept away in the occupation and reforms that followed. The nation that emerged from defeat would be democratic, pacifist, and economically focused, bearing little resemblance to the militarist empire that had terrorized Asia for over a decade. But the memories and scars of empire would remain, shaping East Asian politics and international relations for generations. The empire had fallen, but its legacy would endure. On August 28, 1945, Less than 2 weeks after Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, the first American occupation forces landed at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. 2 days later, on August 30th, General Douglas MacArthur arrived aboard his aircraft Bataan, descending the stairs in sunglasses and an open-collar khaki uniform without a tie, radiating casual confidence. He refused to wear a sidearm, demonstrating his belief that he had nothing to fear from the defeated Japanese. On September 2nd, aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, MacArthur presided over the formal surrender ceremony. His occupation of Japan, one of history's most ambitious attempts to remake a society, had begun. Over the next 6.5 years, American forces would oversee the transformation of Japan from a militaristic empire into a pacifist democracy, rewriting the Constitution, reforming the economy, and reshaping society. The occupation would prove remarkably successful by most measures, yet it would also leave unresolved questions and contradictions that continue to shape Japanese politics and East Asian international relations today. MacArthur established his headquarters in the Dai-ichi Life Insurance Building across from the Imperial Palace. Although the occupation was nominally an Allied enterprise, with representatives from Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other nations advising through the Far Eastern Commission, MacArthur ruled Japan as a virtual military governor. The Soviet Union pushed for greater Allied control over occupation policy, hoping to influence Japan's future as it was influencing Germany's. MacArthur blocked Soviet ambitions, ensuring American control remained absolute. His title, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, abbreviated as SCAP, became synonymous with the occupation bureaucracy and with MacArthur himself. The general approached his task with messianic zeal. He viewed the occupation not merely as punishment for Japan's wartime aggression, but as an opportunity to create a model democracy in Asia. MacArthur saw himself as bringing enlightenment to a feudal society, liberating the Japanese people from militarism and autocracy. This paternalistic attitude suffused every aspect of the occupation. Critics would later condemn it as cultural imperialism, an attempt to impose American values on a fundamentally different society. Defenders argued that Japan desperately needed reform and that MacArthur achieved remarkable changes with Japanese cooperation. The first priority was survival. Japan's economy had collapsed. American bombing had destroyed much of Japan's industrial capacity and housing stock. The merchant marine that had carried food from Korea and Taiwan lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians were returning from former empire territories, straining resources further. The 1945 rice harvest was catastrophic. Urban residents faced starvation. Black markets flourished as people sold possessions for food. Malnutrition was widespread. Disease threatened. MacArthur understood that political reforms meant nothing if people starved. Despite orders not to assume responsibility for Japan's economic rehabilitation, he immediately secured food shipments from the United States. American grain prevented mass starvation through the winter of 1945. Simultaneously, occupation authorities moved to dismantle the structures that had enabled Japanese militarism. The military was dissolved completely. Over 6 million soldiers and sailors were demobilized and sent home. Officers were discharged and barred from public life. Military academies were closed. Arsenals and weapons factories were dismantled. The occupation confiscated and destroyed remaining weapons and military equipment. Japan's military, which had dominated politics for decades and waged war across Asia, ceased to exist. The purge extended beyond the military. SCAP identified and removed from public life anyone who had held leadership positions during the war. Over 200,000 individuals were barred from political office, civil service, business leadership, and education. This included cabinet ministers, military officers, leaders of ultranationalist organizations, executives of major companies involved in war production, and senior bureaucrats. The purge aimed to eliminate the old guard that had led Japan to disaster and create space for new, democratic leadership to emerge. Yet the purge had significant limitations. Emperor Hirohito, arguably the individual most responsible for Japan's wartime policies by virtue of his constitutional position and actual influence, was explicitly protected from prosecution. MacArthur decided within weeks of arriving that retaining the emperor was essential to occupation success. Japanese society remained deeply attached to the emperor despite defeat. Prosecuting Hirohito might provoke resistance that would require massive military force to suppress. Moreover, the emperor's cooperation could facilitate reforms that might otherwise face opposition. On January 1, 1946, Hirohito broadcast the Humanity Declaration, renouncing his divinity and declaring himself human. This satisfied American demands that state Shinto, the ideology that had portrayed the emperor as a living god, be dismantled. The decision to protect Hirohito proved controversial then and remains so today. Critics argued that allowing the emperor to escape accountability while punishing subordinates was fundamentally unjust. Many Allied nations wanted Hirohito tried as a war criminal. Australia and China particularly pressed for his prosecution. But MacArthur prevailed, and American policymakers agreed that stability required keeping Hirohito on the throne. The emperor's protection shaped the subsequent war crimes trials, as prosecutors carefully avoided implicating him while building cases against military and political leaders. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, commonly called the Tokyo War Crimes Trials, convened in May 1946. 28 defendants faced charges including crimes against peace, which meant planning and waging aggressive war, conventional war crimes involving violations of laws of war, and crimes against humanity. The defendants represented Japan's wartime leadership: generals, admirals, prime ministers, foreign ministers, and senior bureaucrats. General Tojo Hideki, prime minister during most of the Pacific War, was the most prominent defendant. Others included General Matsui Iwane, commander during the Nanjing Massacre, and General Doihara Kenji, chief of Japanese intelligence operations in Manchuria. The trials lasted 2.5 years, far longer than the Nuremberg trials. Over 400 witnesses testified. Thousands of documents were entered into evidence. The proceedings were tedious, complex, and emotionally draining. Defense attorneys challenged the tribunal's legitimacy, arguing that aggressive war was not a crime under international law at the time Japan acted. They contended that holding individuals responsible for state actions violated traditional concepts of sovereignty. Some defendants claimed they had opposed aggressive policies but been overruled by military hardliners. Others argued they had simply followed orders or acted in Japan's legitimate self-defense. In November 1948, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. All 25 remaining defendants, 2 having died during the trial and 1 having been declared mentally unfit, were found guilty. 7 received death sentences, including Tojo, Matsui, and Doihara. 16 were sentenced to life imprisonment. 2 received lesser prison terms. On December 23, 1948, the 7 condemned men were hanged at Sugamo Prison. MacArthur refused to allow photographs, sparing the Japanese people the sight of their former leaders being executed. The bodies were cremated and ashes scattered to prevent graves from becoming nationalist shrines. The Tokyo trials established important precedents for international criminal law, affirming that individuals could be held accountable for war crimes, regardless of their positions. Yet the trials faced criticism from multiple directions. Some argued they represented victors' justice, with only the defeated punished, while Allied atrocities went unprosecuted. Others noted selective prosecution, with thousands of potential war criminals never charged. The protection of the emperor and the imperial family seemed to prove that political considerations trumped justice. Most controversially, Indian Judge Radhabinod Pal issued a dissenting opinion arguing all defendants should be acquitted, contending that Western colonialism in Asia negated the Allies' moral authority to judge Japan. While war crimes trials proceeded, ESCAP implemented fundamental reforms to Japanese government and society. The most important was a new constitution. In October 1945, MacArthur suggested to Japanese leaders that they revise the Meiji Constitution. The government produced a draft that made only minor modifications. MacArthur rejected it as inadequate. In February 1946, he ordered his staff to write a constitution themselves. They were given 1 week. The resulting document, drafted primarily by relatively junior American officers with legal training, was presented to the Japanese government as non-negotiable. After intensive negotiations over specific provisions, the cabinet accepted it. The draft was submitted to the Diet, which debated, modified it slightly, and approved it in October 1946. The new constitution took effect May 3, 1947. The Constitution of Japan represented a radical departure from the Meiji Constitution. Sovereignty now rested with the people, not the emperor. The emperor became merely a symbol of the state, with no political power. He could not command the military, convene the Diet, issue emergency decrees, or exercise any functions except ceremonial ones specified in the Constitution. Power flowed from elected representatives in the Diet, which became the highest organ of state power. The Prime Minister, chosen by the Diet, led the government. The cabinet was responsible to the Diet and could be dismissed by a vote of no confidence. The Constitution established an extensive Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion were guaranteed. The right to organize labor unions was protected. Women received equal rights with men, including suffrage and equal treatment in marriage and property law. Torture and cruel punishments were prohibited. The right to a fair trial was ensured. These provisions transformed Japanese society, ending legal discrimination and creating space for political and social movements that had been suppressed. Most famously, Article 9 renounced war and prohibited Japan from maintaining military forces. The full text declared that the Japanese people forever renounced war as a sovereign right, and that land, sea, and air forces would never be maintained. This provision was controversial even during the occupation. Some American officials worried it left Japan defenseless in a dangerous world. MacArthur, however, believed that Japan's military tradition was so deeply rooted that only complete disarmament could prevent militarism's resurgence. Article 9 became central to post-war Japanese identity, with many Japanese embracing pacifism as a core national value. Land reform represented another fundamental change. Before the war, most farmers rented land from absentee landlords, paying up to half their harvest as rent. Rural poverty was severe, and the tenant farmer system had been a source of social unrest. ESCAP ordered comprehensive land reform that transferred land ownership from landlords to tenant farmers. Landlords were required to sell land they did not personally farm, with compensation at prices the wartime inflation had made almost worthless. By 1950, over 90% of farmland was owned by those who worked it. The reform created a rural middle class with a stake in democracy and broke the power of the conservative landlord elite that had supported militarism. SCAP also attempted to break up the zaibatsu, the massive industrial conglomerates that had dominated the Japanese economy. These family-controlled firms, including Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Yasuda, had grown powerful through close cooperation with the military and had profited enormously from war. Initial plans called for dissolving the largest zaibatsu into hundreds of independent companies. Securities were ordered sold. Holding companies were broken up. But zaibatsu dissolution proved more difficult than land reform. The companies were deeply integrated into Japan's economy. Breaking them up risked economic collapse. As Cold War tensions increased, American priorities shifted from punishing Japanese monopolies to rebuilding Japan's economy to serve as a bulwark against communism. This shift in occupation policy, called the reverse course, became evident by 1948. Initially, occupation policy had encouraged labor unions, seeing them as democratic institutions that would counterbalance business power. Union membership exploded, reaching 6 million by 1949. Labor militancy increased with strikes and political activism. When unions threatened a general strike in February 1947, MacArthur banned it, demonstrating limits to his support for labor rights. As unions became increasingly influenced by communists, occupation authorities cracked down. The Purge, which had targeted rightists and militarists, was extended to leftists. Communist Party leaders were removed from public life. Union leaders were dismissed. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, accelerated this conservative turn. The Korean War transformed Japan's role in American strategic thinking. Japan became the primary base for United Nations forces fighting in Korea. Japanese factories produced supplies, equipment, and weapons for the war effort. The occupation's emphasis shifted from reform to economic recovery and rearmament. American procurement during the Korean War jump-started Japanese industrial recovery. Factories that had sat idle began producing again. Unemployment fell. Living standards improved. The war demonstrated Japan's strategic importance to the United States and accelerated plans to end the occupation and restore Japanese sovereignty. Education reform aimed to democratize Japanese schools and eliminate militaristic and ultranationalistic content. Escape purged textbooks, removing passages glorifying war and the emperor. New curricula emphasized critical thinking, democracy, and peace. The education system was restructured on an American model with 6 years of elementary school, 3 years of junior high school, 3 years of high school, and 4 years of university. Co-education was introduced. Teachers' unions formed. The reforms were extensive but controversial, with some Japanese arguing that American educators misunderstood Japanese society and that the new system abandoned valuable traditions. Women's status improved dramatically under the occupation. The new constitution guaranteed women equal rights and suffrage. In the first post-war election in April 1946, 39 women were elected to the Diet. Laws were changed to give women equal rights in marriage, divorce, and property ownership. Women could now choose their spouses rather than accepting arranged marriages. They could initiate divorce proceedings. They could own and inherit property equally with men. These legal changes transformed family structure and gender relations, though traditional attitudes persisted in practice for decades. The occupation also encouraged religious freedom and separated religion from the state. State Shinto, which had made emperor worship mandatory and had been used to promote militarism, was abolished. Shinto shrines became private religious institutions. Christians and Buddhists, who had faced restrictions during the war, could practice freely. New religions emerged and grew rapidly in the post-war chaos, offering spiritual comfort to people traumatized by defeat and social upheaval. By 1950, the occupation's main reforms were complete, and attention turned to ending it. The Cold War had made Japan's strategic position crucial. The United States wanted to maintain military bases in Japan while formally ending the occupation. Negotiations for a peace treaty began, led by American diplomat John Foster Dulles. The Soviet Union demanded harsh terms and extensive reparations. China, now communist after Mao Zedong's victory, was excluded from negotiations. Many Asian nations that had suffered under Japanese occupation wanted reparations and guarantees against future Japanese aggression. The Treaty of San Francisco was signed on September 8, 1951, by Japan and 48 allied nations. The Soviet Union, Poland, and Czechoslovakia refused to sign, objecting to the treaty's leniency toward Japan and its recognition of the nationalist government in Taiwan rather than the People's Republic of China. The treaty formally ended the state of war, recognized Japan's sovereignty, required Japan to accept tribunal judgments regarding war criminals, and settled territorial issues. Japan renounced claims to Korea, Taiwan, the Kuril Islands, Sakhalin, and various Pacific islands. Reparations were addressed through bilateral negotiations with individual countries. Simultaneously with the peace treaty, Japan and the United States signed a security treaty allowing American forces to remain in Japan. The arrangement gave the United States extensive basing rights throughout Japan, particularly in Okinawa, which remained under American administration. In exchange, the United States pledged to defend Japan. This security relationship, revised in 1960 but still in force today, became the cornerstone of Japan's post-war foreign policy. Japan relied on American military protection, allowing it to maintain minimal defense forces and focus resources on economic development. The occupation officially ended April 28, 1952, when the San Francisco Peace Treaty took effect. MacArthur had actually been relieved of his command in April 1951, after President Truman fired him for insubordination during the Korean War. His successor, General Matthew Ridgway, oversaw the occupation's final year. When the occupation ended, Japan regained formal sovereignty, though with the security treaty's constraints, and with Okinawa remaining under American control until 1972. The occupation's legacy remains contested. Its achievements were substantial. Japan adopted democratic institutions and has maintained them successfully for over 70 years. The country renounced militarism and became one of the world's most prosperous democracies. Women gained rights unprecedented in Japanese history. Land reform created rural prosperity. the pacifist constitution shaped national identity and policy. These transformations occurred remarkably quickly and with relatively little resistance, suggesting the reforms resonated with desires for change within Japanese society. Yet, criticisms are equally substantial. The occupation imposed American values on a society with different traditions and needs. Constitutional reforms were dictated rather than developed by Japanese through democratic processes. Article 9's prohibition on military forces became problematic, as Cold War tensions required Japan to contribute to regional security, leading to the creation of self-defense forces that technically violated the Constitution. The protection of Emperor Hirohito and the imperial institution prevented full reckoning with wartime responsibility, enabling nationalist narratives that minimize Japanese aggression and atrocities. War crimes trials were selective, prosecuting only a fraction of those responsible while protecting others for political expediency. Most problematically, the occupation failed to foster full Japanese acknowledgement of wartime atrocities. Unlike Germany, which confronted its Nazi past extensively, Japan's reckoning remained partial and contested. Textbook controversies erupted repeatedly as nationalist politicians and educators minimized Japanese atrocities or portrayed Japan as victim rather than aggressor. Visits by prime ministers to Yasukuni Shrine, which honors war criminals among Japan's war dead, provoked outrage in China and Korea. Disputes over comfort women, forced laborers, and the Nanjing Massacre poisoned relations with neighboring countries. The failure to achieve reconciliation, comparable to what Germany achieved with its neighbors, represents the occupation's most significant shortcoming. The Japanese Empire that had existed from the Meiji Restoration through August 1945 was gone forever. The territories conquered across Asia had been lost. The military that had dominated politics was disbanded. The ideology of emperor worship and Japanese racial superiority was discredited. The institutional structures that had enabled imperial expansion were dismantled. In their place emerged a pacifist, democratic Japan that channeled ambition into economic rather than territorial expansion. Yet the empire's legacy endured in complex ways. In Taiwan and Korea, Japanese colonial rule left deep scars, but also infrastructure and educational systems that influenced post-war development. Some Taiwanese who experienced Japanese colonial rule contrasted it favorably with the nationalist Chinese government that followed. Koreans harbored deep resentment toward Japan while acknowledging certain modernizations. In Southeast Asia, Japan's destruction of European colonial empires, even though Japan's own imperialism replaced them temporarily, contributed to post-war independence movements. Within Japan, memories of empire remained contested. Some Japanese regarded the imperial period with pride, emphasizing modernization achievements and viewing the Pacific War as legitimate self-defense against Western encirclement. Others saw the empire as a period of militaristic madness that brought disaster. Pacifists drew lessons about the dangers of militarism. Nationalists argued Japan should regain normal military capabilities. These debates continued into the 21st century, shaping political divisions and complicating Japan's relationships with China, Korea, and other Asian nations. The occupation period from 1945 to 1952 represented the third great transformation in modern Japanese history, following the Meiji Restoration and the militaristic period that followed Japan's victories over China and Russia. Each transformation involved wholesale adoption of foreign models, rapid institutional change, and dramatic shifts in national identity. The Meiji Restoration borrowed from the West to build a modern state. The imperial period drew on Japanese tradition and militaristic ideologies to justify expansion. The occupation imposed American democratic values to remake Japan as a peaceful nation. What emerged from the occupation was neither traditionally Japanese nor simply American. Japan became a unique hybrid, combining aspects of Japanese culture and tradition with democratic institutions and pacifist ideology. The Constitution, though drafted by Americans, became deeply valued by many Japanese. Democracy, though imposed by occupiers, developed genuine roots. The self-defense forces, technically unconstitutional, became accepted as necessary while maintaining strong civilian control. Article 9, though violated in practice, remains symbolically important. The The economic miracle that followed the occupation validated, in many Japanese eyes, the post-war settlement. By focusing on economic development rather than military power, Japan became the world's second-largest economy by 1968. Living standards rose dramatically. Japanese companies competed globally. Tokyo hosted the Olympics in 1964, symbolizing Japan's acceptance back into the international community. The post-war system, whatever its origins in defeat and occupation, had delivered prosperity and peace. Yet unresolved historical issues continued to poison relations with Asian neighbors. The Yasukuni shrine visits, textbook controversies, disputes over territory like the Senkaku Islands, and debates over comfort women kept wartime grievances alive. Chinese and Korean demands for apologies and acknowledgement of atrocities clashed with Japanese sensitivities and nationalist resistance. Unlike Europe, where Germany's thorough confrontation with its past enabled reconciliation, Asia lacked comparable closure. The empire's victims could not forget, and some Japanese refused to remember fully. The occupation ended 70 years ago, but its effects shape Japan today. The Constitution remains unamended despite decades of debate over revision. The security alliance with the United States anchors Japanese foreign policy. Pacifist sentiment remains strong even as security threats increase. Democratic institutions have proven durable. Women's rights, though still limited compared to some Western nations, far exceed pre-war norms. The emperor remains a symbol without power. These legacies of occupation, built on the ruins of empire, define modern Japan. The Japanese empire's story, from its birth in Meiji ambition, through its destruction in atomic fire, to its transformation under American occupation, reveals the possibilities and limits of imperial expansion, the costs of militarism, and the challenges of democratization. It demonstrates that nations can change fundamentally, that defeat can lead to reconstruction, and that imposed reforms can take root if they address genuine needs. But it also shows that historical wounds heal slowly, that unresolved grievances poison international relations, and that confronting the past requires courage that political leaders often lack. The empire is gone, but its shadow falls across East Asia still, a reminder that history's burdens are not easily shed, and that the consequences of imperial ambition outlast the empires themselves.